There is something strange happening right now as you read this. Somewhere in the world at this very minute, a woman is kneeling before a statue. Her knees ache, the ground is cold. She is crying for a sick child, for a husband who betrayed her, for a life that was not what she dreamed. She looks up at the painted face of a woman who never knew her, and whispers requests she could never voice aloud to any living human being. And that statue, made of plaster, wood, marble, it doesn't matter, looks back with downcast eyes, always downcast, never direct. Have you ever stopped to think about that? In all the images of Mary you have ever seen in your life, in all of them, without exception, where is she looking? Down, to the side, at the child in her lap, at her own folded hands, rarely forward, almost never into your eyes. Meanwhile, in the same church, the image of the crucified Christ looks up toward the Father. The eyes of St. Paul, in a painting nearby, shine with intellectual fervor. St. Peter gazes at the sky with the authority of one who holds the keys. The apostles, the prophets, the doctors of the church may all have gaze, all have direction, all have voice painted on their faces. Mary does not. Mary lowers her eyes. And this is not an artistic coincidence. This was not a random choice by some distracted painter on some ordinary morning in the 15th century. This is a rule, a strict rule, imposed by centuries of theological treatises, pastoral letters, manuals for sacred artists that defined, with almost military precision, how the Virgin could and how she could never be represented. And the question that tears through the silence of 2,000 years is this: who wrote these rules, and why? My name does not matter here. What matters is the name of the man who, over 3 centuries ago, was the first to look at these rules with the coldness of a watchmaker disassembling a mechanism. The sacred image to him was exactly that, a mechanism, a machine for producing specific feelings in specific people, calculated to function with the same precision with which a bronze gear turns inside a Swiss watch. That man's name is Baruch Spinoza. And before you think I'm going to introduce you to a boring old philosopher from an academic book, I need to quickly tell you who he was, because his story is, in itself, one of the most electrifying in Western philosophy. Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632, into a family of Jews who had fled the Portuguese Inquisition, fled from the stake, fled from torture, fled from ecclesiastical courts that extracted confessions of heresy with red-hot irons. This was the memory that ran through the veins of his community, the memory of having been hunted for their faith. And what did this same community do when young Baruch, in his early 20s, began to ask questions they did not want to hear? Exactly what had been done to them. They did not burn his body, it is true. Holland was more tolerant. But they burned his social existence. They decreed the cherem, the greatest excommunication in Judaism, with words so violent that when you read the original document even today, you feel a chill down your spine. They said he should be cursed day and night, that no one could live under the same roof as him, that no one could come within 4 steps of him, that no one could read anything he wrote. In essence, that he was dead, even while alive. And do you know what Spinoza's response was? He did not shout, he did not beg, he did not try to defend himself. He simply moved to another city, rented a tiny room, bought a lens polishing lathe, and began to write, calmly, systematically, with the patience of one who knows he is writing not for his time but for the centuries to come. He polished lenses by day to earn his bread. He wrote at night, by candlelight, in small, neat handwriting, the books that would shake the foundations of Western thought. One of those works contained an idea that, if you stop to think about it, seems too simple to have caused such scandal. The idea was more or less this: everything that human beings call sacred was at some point made by human hands, and everything made by human hands carries, embedded in it, the interests, fears, prejudices, and desires of those who made it. Therefore, and here is the phrase that made kings and popes want his neck, if you want to understand any religious image, you should not just ask, what does it represent? You should also ask, who gained what by making it represent this? Think about that for a second. Who gained what by deciding that Mary would be white? when the historical Mary, a Jewish woman from Nazareth, had skin tanned by the Middle Eastern sun? Who gained what by deciding that she would be silent, when the few biblical fragments where she speaks, the Magnificat for example, are, if you read carefully, one of the most politically revolutionary songs in the entire Bible, speaking of bringing down the powerful from their thrones? Who gained what by deciding that she would be a virgin not only before Jesus, but throughout her life, despite the Gospels clearly mentioning the brothers of Jesus, James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, something that theologians have spent centuries trying to explain with increasingly convoluted linguistic acrobatics? Who gained what by deciding that she would be pure, immaculate, untouchable, elevated to an ontological category so far above any other woman that no real woman, made of flesh, blood, desire, and menstruation, could ever even dream of approaching that model? Spinoza looked at these questions and answered, with the calmness of a mathematician solving an equation. Those who gained were the builders of the image, and what they gained was control. A subtle, deep, almost invisible control, because it operated not through force, but through love. People did not obey the image because they were forced. They obeyed because they loved. And this kind of obedience, the one that comes from love, is the most powerful that exists. It is the hardest to dismantle, because dismantling it seems, to those who believe, a betrayal of the very heart. I know what you might be feeling right now. Some discomfort, some resistance. Perhaps a thought like, but my faith is real. My grandmother felt real things praying to Mary. This can't just be political construction. And I respond, you are right. The feelings are real. The human search for the divine is real. The comfort that people find in that image is real, for those who feel it. But one thing does not exclude the other. It is perfectly possible, and Spinoza would be the first to agree, that the feelings provoked by an image are authentic, and at the same time that the image that provokes them was deliberately designed over centuries to provoke exactly those feelings in exactly those people with exactly that objective. A well-made advertisement provokes real desire for the advertised product. The desire is true, but that does not mean the product is what the advertisement says. The question Spinoza poses, and that I invite you to examine with me in the coming hours, is this. What if the image of Mary, as it has been handed down to us, has been the most enduring, most successful and most transformative advertisement in human history? An advertisement whose product was neither Mary, nor Jesus, nor God, but a specific model of femininity, obedient, silent, asexual, submissive, white, maternal, and above all, pure. And what if this purity, this word that seems so innocent, so beautiful, so harmless, has actually been the cruelest weapon ever invented against women? Because purity requires its opposite to exist. For the pure to exist, the impure must exist. For the virgin to exist, the prostitute must exist. For Mary to exist, Eve must exist. That other image, almost always painted as guilty, as the origin of all evils, as the one who disobeyed. And between these two poles, the pure above, the impure below, every real woman has been forced to fit, to measure herself, to judge herself, to shame herself. For 2,000 years. This is the conversation we are going to have. It will be long. It will be uncomfortable at various moments. It will require something rare in the times we live in. Patience, willingness to listen to an entire argument before reacting, courage to feel the tremor that happens when an old idea begins to crack. But I promise you one thing. If you stay until the end, if you cross with me through Spinoza's life, the excommunication, the silence of lenses being polished in the early morning, the historical construction of the Marian image century by century, the councils, the dogmas, the imperial interests, the commissioned paintings, the real women crushed along the way. If you stay until the end, you will not come out the same. You will look at that woman in the blue mantle with different eyes, perhaps with more compassion, perhaps with more doubt, perhaps with more tenderness for all the mothers, daughters, grandmothers, and friends in your life who unknowingly have been measured by a ruler that was never human. Breathe. Because Spinoza's silence, That silence of 350 years inside a poor room in The Hague is about to be broken. Amsterdam, 1656. The city wakes up shrouded in mist. The smell of the sea enters through the cracks of the red brick houses, laden with salt, fish, and wet wood. The canals reflect a white-grey sky, and the first carts begin to roll over the uneven stones of the streets, pulled by thick-furred horses that puff clouds of steam into the cold air. It is the most tolerant city in Europe. The city where Protestants, clandestine Catholics, Portuguese Jews, Ottoman Muslims, French Huguenots, English Quakers all found some kind of refuge. The city that sold the world tulips, spices, forbidden books, and freedom. But there is a specific neighborhood in this city where, on this July morning, something is about to happen. Something that history books will say, centuries later, was one of the most violent excommunications ever recorded in all of Judaism. The neighborhood is called Vluyenburg. It is an artificial island, built on wooden stakes driven into the mud of the Amstel River. It is home to Sephardic Jews, the descendants of those who were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, when Isabella and Ferdinand signed the Alhambra Decree and ordered that every Jew leave the kingdom or convert to Catholicism under penalty of death. Many converted, on the surface. They remained Jews in secret, in basements, in attics, praying quietly the Shema Israel while pretending to swallow the host at Sunday Mass. They were called Marranos, Conversos, New Christians, and for 3 centuries the Inquisition hunted them down as one hunts rats, extracting confessions on torture racks, burning grandparents in public squares, confiscating properties, separating children from parents. Those who managed to escape arrived in Amsterdam like shipwrecked survivors from a storm that lasted generations. And when they arrived, finally free, finally allowed to be what they had always been in secret, they built there in that tiny neighborhood one of the most intense, cultured, and orthodoxy-hungry Jewish communities in modern history. It is important to understand this. It is fundamental, because without this, you will not comprehend why this community, so newly out of the flames, did to one of its own what the Inquisition had done to their parents and grandparents. Why they, who knew in their own skin what it was like to be persecuted for thinking differently, became themselves persecutors. This is one of the great mysteries of human nature, and Spinoza would spend much of his life trying to understand it. But let's return to that July morning. The Portuguese synagogue, the Esnogas, which still exists today, you can visit it. The wooden benches remain the same. The oil lamps are still lit during solemn ceremonies, opens its doors. The men of the community arrive dressed in black, with their wide-brimmed hats, trimmed beards, and serious faces. The women, from the upper balcony, look on in silence. Everyone knows what is about to happen. Everyone has heard the rumors. Everyone has whispered in recent weeks about that 23-year-old young man, son of Michael de Spinoza, a respected merchant, recently deceased. The young man's name is Baruch. And Baruch, as everyone in the community knows, has been saying dangerous things. Not in public at first, in conversations with friends, with study colleagues, with curious young men like him. But the rumors began to leak. They say the young Espinoza claims that God has no body, no voice, no face. They say he claims that the human soul is not immortal in the way the rabbis teach. They say he claims that the Torah was not written by Moses, but compiled by human hands many centuries after the events it narrates. They say he claims that the Mosaic laws are not eternal ordinances of the Most High, but codes of political conduct adapted to an ancient society that no longer exists. They tried to convince him to back down. Rabbis came to speak with him. Family friends came to plead. One of them, according to an old legend that historians still debate today, offered Baruch a considerable annual pension if he would just pretend to believe, just show up at the synagogue, just not write anything compromising. The young man reportedly refused with a phrase worth remembering: "If I am paid to lie, the price will never be high enough. If I am paid for the truth, it cannot be bought." And so, on that morning of July 27th, 1656, the rabbi ascends to the bema, opens a scroll and begins to read in Hebrew, with a trembling voice of contained emotion, the text of the cherem. If I translate this text literally for you, you will feel the weight. You will feel the violence. You will understand why, when philosophy students read this document for the first time, many fall silent for long minutes. It says, in essence, that by decree of the angels and by sentence of the saints, Baruch Spinoza is excommunicated, cursed and expelled with the consent of the Holy Blessed One, and with the consent of this entire holy congregation. It says that he must be cursed day and cursed night, cursed when he lies down and cursed when he rises, cursed when he goes out and cursed when he comes in, that the Lord will not forgive him, that the wrath of the Lord will burn against this man, that all the curses written in the book of the Torah will fall upon him, that his name will be erased from under the heavens, and it finally orders that no one communicate with him either in writing or spoken word, that no one grant him any favor, that no one be under the same roof with him, that no one come within 4 cubits of him, that no one read any writing dictated or written by him. Erasure. That is the key word. Erasing a human being from social existence, making him live as if he were a ghost, as if he had died without his body falling. And where is Baruch while this text is being read? He is not in the synagogue. He did not go there. Some say he was at home, working. Others say he had already left Amsterdam. What we know for sure is that when he received the news of the excommunication, his reaction was perhaps the most philosophically perfect one a human being could have in the face of such violence. He reportedly said, according to later records, something like, "Very well. This does not obligate me to do anything I was not already determined to do." And what was he determined to do? Think, write, live. He left Amsterdam. He went to a small town called Rijnsburg, near Leiden. He rented a room in the house of a Protestant doctor, a simple man who welcomed him without asking questions. He set up his lens-polishing lathe there, a profession he chose not by chance, but precisely because it allowed for independence. As long as there were lenses to be polished, there would be bread. And as long as there was bread, Spinoza would not need to lie to anyone, would not need to pretend to have faith he did not possess, would not need to kiss the hand of any noble, any cardinal, any rabbi. He was 23 years old and had just become, perhaps, the freest man in Europe. Free, but alone. Terribly alone. The days in Rijnsburg all felt the same. He woke up early, with the crowing of roosters and the sound of Protestant bells. He worked a few hours at the lathe, polishing the lenses that would be sent to opticians in Amsterdam and The Hague. Glass was dangerous. The dust that came off while polishing entered the lungs. Spinoza coughed a lot. The doctors of the time still did not fully understand the relationship between that occupation and the tuberculosis that would later kill him young, at the age of 44. But he knew. He felt it in his chest, and he continued. In the afternoon he read Latin, Hebrew, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, a bit of Greek, books on mathematics, on physics, on the recent revolution initiated by Copernicus and Galileo, books by Descartes, whose methods enchanted him and whose conclusions irritated him, books by the ancient Stoics, and of course the Bible, but read now with different eyes, read as if it were any ancient text, as a historian would read Herodotus, or as a philologist would read Homer, looking for the seams, looking for the contradictions, looking for the human hands behind the words said to be from God himself. At night he wrote. Page after page, in small, careful handwriting, the first drafts of what would become his most famous work, The Ethics. A book constructed like a geometry treatise, with definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, and corollaries, because Spinoza believed that philosophical truth should be as rigorous as mathematical truth. No inflamed rhetoric, no appeals to sentiment, just the clear coldness of reason advancing step by step to its inevitable conclusions. And among those conclusions, there was one he knew to be the most dangerous of all. A conclusion that, if published in his lifetime, would lead him not only to the Jewish excommunication he had already suffered, but also to persecution from all the Christian churches in Europe, Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, all. A conclusion that even today, more than 3 centuries later, still provokes astonishment when stated in full. The conclusion was this: God has no image. God cannot have an image, and any image that human beings produce to represent the sacred, any statue, any painting, any figure carved in marble or carved in wood, is not a window to the divine, but a projection of the interests, fears, and desires of the human beings who made it. Therefore, to worship an image is not to worship God. It is to worship oneself. It is to worship one's own reflection without realizing it. And Spinoza knew, of course he knew, he was a man of prodigious erudition, that the most powerful, most widespread, most reproduced, most worshipped image in all of Western civilization was neither that of the crucified Christ, nor that of God the Father with a white beard, nor that of the holy apostles with their golden halos. It was the image of a woman in a blue mantle, a woman with downcast eyes, a woman whose mouth, in 1,000 years of sacred art, has almost never opened to say absolutely anything. And it is about this woman, about the historical, political, theological, and artistic construction of this woman, that Spinoza would begin in his notebooks to make the first notes. Notes that he would never publish in full during his lifetime, for obvious reasons. Notes that would survive in fragments, in letters, in margins of manuscripts, in seemingly disconnected phrases scattered throughout his posthumously published books. Notes that, when gathered, reveal one of the most incendiary theses ever produced by modern philosophy. The thesis that the image of Mary, the image you know, that your mother knows, that all of humanity recognizes with closed eyes, may have been constructed over the centuries not to tell you who she was, but to teach you who you should be. Rheinsberg was small, so small that on a clear sky day a man could walk across it from one end to the other in less than an hour. Low houses, red roofs slanted against the rains of the North Sea, a modest canal cutting through the village in the middle, windmills lazily turning in the distance, in the wheat fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a city of dissenting Protestants, of people who had separated from the official churches because they believed that true faith was an inner, silent thing that did not need priests nor bishops nor cathedrals. They were called collegiants. They gathered in colleges, in discussion circles, in small groups where anyone could speak. Anyone could read the scriptures. Anyone could suggest a new interpretation. And it was among these people, marginal within Protestantism itself, that Spinoza found his first true home after the excommunication. He rented a room in the house of a doctor named Hermann Hohmann. The house still exists, preserved as a museum. You can enter it today, climb the narrow wooden stairs, enter the tiny room where the philosopher slept and worked, and feel, if your sensitivity allows, the heavy silence of that place. The floorboards creak softly. The window looks out onto a garden where medicinal herbs still grow today, just as they did in his time. The light enters at an angle, yellowed, that specific light of northern Europe that the Dutch painters of the 17th century captured so precisely in their paintings. And it was in that light, in that silence, in that room, that Spinoza began to develop the method that would change Western philosophy forever. The method had a complicated technical name, geometric method, but what it meant in practice was much simpler and much more frightening than it seems. It meant treating the most sacred questions of human existence, God, the soul, good, evil, love, freedom, with the same coldness with which a mathematician treats triangles, defining each term precisely, establishing indisputable axioms, demonstrating each conclusion step by step without appealing to authority, without appealing to tradition, without appealing to divine revelation. Just reason, advancing like a sharp blade through centuries of accumulated certainties. And when this method was applied to the study of sacred images, what happened? This happened. Spinoza began with the seemingly innocent question, what is an image? Answer. An image is a representation made by a human being using physical materials, paint, wood, stone, fabric, to evoke in another human being a certain idea or feeling. Second question. Where does the idea that the artist tries to evoke come from? Answer. From their mind, which in turn was shaped by the culture in which they live, by the institutions that educated them, by the interests of those who paid them to make the image. Third question. To what extent, then, does the image represent what it claims to represent? And here was the punch to the gut. The image, Spinoza concluded with the calmness of a geometer proving a theorem, always and necessarily represents not the thing itself, but the idea that human beings constructed about the thing. And since this idea was constructed over centuries, passing through 1,000 filters of interest and power, the distance between the image and the thing represented can be, and often is, immense. Imagine what this meant applied to the figure of Mary. The historical Mary, if she existed, and almost all serious historians agree that a woman named Miriam, mother of a certain Yeshua of Nazareth, did indeed exist. This Mary was a woman who lived around the year 1 of the Christian era, in a small village in Galilee, a rural province of the Roman Empire. Miriam is a Hebrew name. She probably spoke Aramaic in her daily life and knew some Hebrew from prayers. She was likely illiterate, like 97% of the women of her time and place. She probably married very young, as was customary, perhaps at 13 or 14 years old. She likely had several children, not just one. The Gospels mention in passing without ceremony the brothers of Jesus, James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and some sisters whose names were not preserved. She probably worked hard from dawn to dusk, grinding wheat on stones, fetching water from the well, weaving wool, tending a small flock of goats if the family was lucky, burying children when infant mortality took its toll, and it did terribly, in a world without antibiotics, without vaccines, without knowledge of germs. She was probably dark-skinned, her skin tanned by the relentless sun of the Middle East, dark, almost black eyes like most Semitic women, thick black hair tied under a heavy scarf as was customary for married Jewish women of the time, calloused hands, feet hardened by crude leather sandals. Her teeth, by the age of 30, probably already beginning to deteriorate because dentistry was almost non-existent and the diet included many ground grains that wore down the enamel. None of this appears in the image of Mary that has reached us. None. The image that Western civilization has constructed over the last 1,500 years shows a white woman, light skin, sometimes pale as porcelain, brown hair, sometimes red, sometimes blonde, almost never black and almost never hidden under headscarves as a married Jewish woman would truly hide. Blue eyes in many representations. That's right, blue. On a Semitic woman of the 1st century. Fine, delicate European features, often approaching the specific aesthetic standards of the region where the painter lived. Italians painted an Italian Mary. Flemish painted a Flemish Mary. Spaniards painted a Mary with Iberian features. Each culture shaped Mary in its own image, and then claimed that image was universal, eternal, true. Ask yourself now, with all honesty, how could it be possible for each European culture to have independently arrived at the same conclusion about what Mary looked like, and that conclusion was, what a coincidence, exactly how the women of that culture looked? The answer is obvious, but uncomfortable. It was not a coincidence. The images of Mary were not representing a real woman. They were representing an ideal, and the ideal was updated, adapted, molded according to the cultural context. In Renaissance Italy, she became a Tuscan noblewoman. In Baroque Spain, a melancholic lady with green eyes. In Gothic Germany, an elongated and ethereal figure. In colonial Latin America, she sometimes took on slightly mixed features, but remained stubbornly lighter than the indigenous and black women who prayed before her. Who decided all this? It wasn't Mary, of course. She had been dead for centuries when these images began to be systematically painted. It wasn't Jesus. He was also dead. It wasn't the apostles, also dead. It was a long chain of human decisions spread over approximately 1,500 years, made primarily by men, priests, bishops, popes, theologians, artists, and rulers, who together were building what Spinoza would call, if he had used that word, a device, a cultural device, a social machine whose function was to produce in each new generation a certain specific type of religious feeling associated with a certain specific type of feminine ideal. And now I need to pause for a moment because I need to tell you something. If you have made it this far, it is because something in you was not frightened by these questions. Something in you recognized, perhaps, that these doubts had crossed your mind in some corner, at some moment, perhaps on a sleepless night, perhaps in front of some image, perhaps listening to a homily that no longer made sense. You are the minority of people who prefer the uncomfortable truth to the comfortable complacency. And this, believe me, is one of the rarest and most precious things in the world we live in today. But I wanted to ask you something before we continue walking through the cold Netherlands of Spinoza. If this conversation is touching you in some way, if these questions are igniting something in your mind, write a comment now. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It can be a single word. It can be a doubt. It can be a memory of someone in your life, a grandmother, a mother, a sister, who was judged for not being pure enough, who was measured by an invisible and impossible ruler. Write, because comments are the only way we have in this world of algorithms that decide what you will see tomorrow, to tell each other, I am here. I am thinking too. I am not alone in this question. And if this content, for even a second, made you look at something familiar with new eyes, subscribe to the channel. This is not formality. It is much deeper than that. Here's the thing. Channels like this that are willing to engage with an adult, intelligent audience about real philosophy, without fear of touching on subjects that most prefer to avoid, only survive because people like you decide to stay. Decide to come back. Decide to be part of this small, silent community of seekers. Spinoza died thinking he had almost no one reading what he wrote. You will hear that he was wrong, but only discovered this after death. We, here, have the chance not to wait so long. We can, right now, form this circle. This small college of free thinkers, just like the Dutch collegians who welcomed the young excommunicated in Rijnsburg 370 years ago. Subscribe. Comment. Stay. Because what lies ahead, the next hours within this story, requires company. You cannot walk alone through these corridors, and I promise that if you stay, I won't let go of your hand. Back to Spinoza. In that small room in Rijnsburg, between one polished lens and another, he began to write a work that he would never publish in his entire lifetime for reasons of survival. The name he would later give it is known in Latin as Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Theological Political Treatise, one of the most dangerous books ever written in the history of modern Europe. When it was finally published in 1670, anonymously, with a fake publisher on the cover to mislead censorship, it caused such a scandal that it was banned in practically every country on the continent. Priests preached against it from the pulpit. Rabbis burned it publicly. Calvinist Protestants wrote furious refutations. Catholics placed it on the Index, the list of books prohibited by the Vatican, where it would remain for centuries. And what was the crime of this book? The crime was treating the Bible as a book, just that. Not just any book. Spinoza had profound respect for the biblical texts. He knew them by heart in Hebrew. But as a book written by human beings, in human contexts, with human purposes. A book that needed to be read with the same critical rigor as any other ancient book. A book whose true authors were unknown, whose dates of composition were uncertain, whose narratives bore evident marks of successive edits, of overlapping layers, of later interpolations. Spinoza was the first man in modern Europe to say in no uncertain terms that Moses did not write the Pentateuch, that the internal evidence of the text itself showed this irrefutably, that there were passages narrating Moses' own death and what happened afterward. Hardly would Moses have written about his own burial, that there were geographical references that only make sense for someone writing centuries later, that there were contradictions between parallel narratives of the same story, indicating that texts from different origins had been stitched together by a late editor. These observations seem obvious today. Any liberal theology student learns this in their first year, but in the 17th century, saying them out loud was practically a death sentence. And what does this have to do with the image of Mary? Everything. Because if Spinoza's method worked to dismantle the divine authorship of sacred texts, it also worked to dismantle the divine authorship of sacred images. If the Torah did not fall ready from the sky, but was composed, edited, and reorganized by human hands over centuries, then the image of Mary also did not fall ready from the sky. It was composed, edited, and reorganized by human hands over centuries. And if you want to understand what she really is, You need to do the same thing Spinoza did with the texts. Look for the seams, the layers, the edits, the hidden interests beneath the appearance of eternity. That is exactly what we are going to start doing in the next step of this journey. We will go back to the beginning. We will try to see, as far as it is possible to see, through the fog of 20 centuries, who the real woman was, before she became an image. And then, layer by layer, we will follow the slow political, theological, artistic process by which this woman was progressively buried under the figure that has reached us. Before anything else, take a second and breathe. Because what we are going to do now is perhaps the hardest thing in this entire journey. We will try to see through the dust of 20 centuries a real woman. Not a symbol, not a dogma, not an image, a woman. With lungs, with bones, with sweat on her temples, with back pain after a whole day carrying water from the well, with the specific fatigue of being a mother in a time when half of the children died before the age of 5. Her name was Miriam. That was her name in Aramaic, the language she spoke daily. In Hebrew, the language of prayers, it was written Miriam, the same letters that, centuries earlier, had identified another famous Miriam, the sister of Moses, the one who sang by the Red Sea after the crossing, the one who was called a prophetess in the book of Exodus. Names in the ancient Jewish world were not chosen by chance. They were echoes. They were inheritances. A child born in Nazareth around 16 or 17 years before the Common Era, because that is probably when Mary was born, if the dating most accepted by historians of the historical Jesus is correct. A child named Miriam carried within the syllables of her own name the memory of a strong woman who had prophesied, sung, and also, according to the biblical text, argued with her own brother Moses to the point of being punished by God with a temporary skin disease. Miriam was not a name of fragility. It was a name of courage. Nazareth, where she lived, was a tiny village. When archaeologists excavated the layers corresponding to the 1st century, they found evidence of a population that probably did not exceed 200 or 300 people. Stone houses with a central courtyard, cisterns carved into the rock to store rainwater, small olive groves, a few fig trees, 1 or 2 presses for squeezing oil. It was so insignificant that the Gospel of John preserves a revealing expression, said by Nathanael, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" The question implies that the obvious answer for any inhabitant of Galilee at the time would be, of course not. Nazareth was a dead end, a tiny dot lost among the hills, about 6 kilometers from the Greco-Roman city of Sepphoris, where the real action was: trade, public baths, theaters, Roman administration. Miriam grew up in this rural, poor, deeply Jewish environment. A girl like any other girl of her time and place. She learned early the task of grinding grains with handstones, 2 circular stones, one on top of the other, turned with the effort of her arms until the wheat turned into coarse flour. She learned to knead bread, to light the fire with flint, to weave sheep wool on a hand loom. She learned the prayers in biblical Hebrew that she probably did not fully understand, because her everyday language was Galilean Aramaic, a dialect that the Jews of Judea considered provincial and even somewhat ridiculous. Above all, she learned what it meant to be a woman in a strict patriarchal society, where her social value was measured by virginity before marriage, fertility during marriage, and obedience after marriage. And it was in this context that, according to the oldest Christian texts, something happened to her. Here, it is important to pause, because what happened or what was said to have happened deeply depends on who you ask and which source you choose to consult. The Gospel of Mark, which is the oldest of the 4 canonical Gospels, written around the year 70 of our era, therefore approximately 40 years after the death of Jesus, says absolutely nothing about a miraculous birth. Mark begins his narrative with Jesus, already an adult, being baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist. The childhood of Jesus for Mark seems to be irrelevant. Mary appears little, and when she does, she appears in a way that leaves many modern Christians uncomfortable. In Mark 3 verses 21 and 31, Jesus' family, his mother and his brothers, come to try to take him back home because people said he had gone mad, and Jesus responds, before the crowd, with a cutting phrase, "Who is my mother? And who are my brothers? Anyone who does the will of God is my brother, my sister, and my mother." Read that again, slowly. There is no special veneration for Mary in the oldest gospel. There is, on the contrary, a certain family tension. The mother appears worried about her son. The brothers appear along with her, and Jesus effectively disidentifies himself from this biological family in favor of the community of followers. The Gospel of Matthew, written about a decade after Mark, is the first to introduce the narrative of the virgin birth. Matthew says that Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. Joseph, a just man, considered putting her away secretly to avoid exposing her publicly, which makes it clear that, in the narrative, a pregnancy before marriage was indeed a cause for scandal and public shame. An angel appeared in a dream and explained the mystery. Joseph accepted, and Matthew cites as justification a prophecy from the book of Isaiah, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son." Here, historians and linguists have spent centuries analyzing an important curiosity. The Hebrew word used in Isaiah 7:14 is not Bethula, which specifically means intact virgin. The word is Alma, which simply means young woman of marriageable age. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, around the 3rd century before Christ, the translation called the Septuagint, the translators rendered Alma as Parthenos, which in Greek means virgin in the strict sense. Matthew, writing in Greek and using the Septuagint, quoted this translation. And so, due to a choice made by translators more than 2 centuries before Mary's birth, a prophecy that originally spoke only of a young woman who would give birth was transformed, in later Christian tradition, into a prophecy about a virgin who conceives without a man. I am not telling you this to attack anyone's faith. I am telling you this because Spinoza would say, and would say in no uncertain terms, words matter, translation, choices matter, layers matter. And you cannot understand what a sacred image represents without understanding the chain of human decisions that produced each element of that image. The Gospel of Luke, written around the year 85, further developed the theme of the birth and added something revolutionary. It added the voice of Mary. In Luke 1, the young Miriam responds to the angel's announcement not with silent obedience, as later painters would portray, but with a direct question. How will this be, since I do not know a man? And then, pregnant, she visits her cousin Elizabeth and bursts into a song called the Magnificat. If you have never read this song carefully, it is important to read it now. She sings. A young, poor, rural woman, pregnant out of wedlock in a society that stoned women in this situation, sings. And what she says is impressive. She says that God has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the humble, that he has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty, that he has shown the strength of his arm and scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. It is not a submissive song. It is not a song of a silent woman. It is a prophetic, political, revolutionary song in the tradition of the ancient Hebrew prophets. It is a manifesto. Keep that in mind because it is important. Because almost none of the images of Mary that have reached you represent this woman singing about bringing down the mighty from their thrones. The images represent, in their overwhelming majority, a serene, silent figure with downcast eyes, hands clasped, incapable of any indignation. And this is not an accident. It is selection. In 2,000 years of sacred art, someone chose which Mary would be represented and which Mary would be forgotten, chose the Mary of "Let it be to me according to your word," and hid the Mary of "He has brought down the mighty from their thrones," chose the obedient and silenced the prophetic. The Gospel of John, the last of the 4 canonical Gospels, written around the year 95 or 100, brings yet another dimension. John does not even mention the virgin birth. His concern is different, more mystical, more theological. But he mentions Mary in 2 striking scenes, at the wedding at Cana, where she intervenes in Jesus' first miracle, and at the foot of the cross, where she is present while her son dies. In this second scene, Jesus entrusts her to the beloved disciple, saying, "Woman, behold your son." The word used is woman, in Greek, gynae, not mother. Some exegetes have tried to soften the impact of this word, but it is the one in the text. This is essentially all the historical material we have about Mary in the canonical texts. A few dozen verses, scattered across the four Gospels, with significant tensions and differences between the sources. Add to that a mention in the Acts of the Apostles, where she appears among the first disciples gathered in Jerusalem after the resurrection, and basically that is it. It seems little, doesn't it? And it is little, it is frighteningly little when you compare it to the oceanic volume of theology, dogma, images, prayers, litanies, apparitions, miracles, and traditions that have been built upon this woman in the 2,000 years that followed. It is as if someone had received a charcoal sketch, 4 or 5 quick lines on a piece of paper, and from those 4 or 5 lines had painted an entire cathedral, from vault to altar, with thousands of details invented along the way. Each detail justified as tradition, later revelation, sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful people. But none of those details were originally in the sketch. Spinoza, reading these texts with the same rigor with which he polished his lenses, saw this clearly. He wrote in his notes that the difference between what was in the texts and what was taught by the Church about those texts was so great that it could only be explained by political and institutional interests accumulated over the centuries. The historical Mary, if someone honestly wanted to try to reconstruct her, would have to be a much more human figure, much more conflicted, much more Jewish, much poorer, and much less white, less silent, and less ethereal than any image reproduced in European sacred art. A woman with black hair hidden under a thick wool scarf, with calloused hands from grinding grains, with skin burned by the sun, with a provincial Galilean accent that the priests of Jerusalem found ridiculous, with several children, one of whom turned out to be particularly restless, controversial, persecuted, and ended up being executed by crucifixion, a penalty reserved by the Romans for rebellious slaves and political agitators. A woman who, if the scene of Golgotha described by the Gospels actually happened, saw her adult son die one of the cruelest deaths ever invented by humanity. A woman who mourned that son as any mother would mourn, who watched over that body, who continued living afterward because life does not stop, because the other children also needed her, because the bread needed to be kneaded even after the tragedy. This is the Mary who probably existed, and this Mary, the human, the real, the burdened with concrete pain and concrete joys and concrete wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, this Mary was slowly erased, century after century, to make way for a figure that fit the interests of those who were directing the institution that was being built in her son's name. Jerusalem, around the year 70 of the Common Era. The city is in flames. The fire rises high, consuming dry cedar wood that lined the interior of the temple, that magnificent temple rebuilt by Herod decades earlier, with enormous stones that still survive today as the Western Wall. The Roman legions commanded by General Titus advanced upon the holy city of the Jews after a brutal siege. Famine had already killed tens of thousands before the final fall. The survivors now see the essence of classical Judaism, the centralized worship in the temple, the animal offerings, the high priest entering the Holy of Holies, disappear amid the smoke. It seems distant from our story, but it is not. It is central. Because this event, the destruction of the temple in the year 70, changes everything for the first followers of Jesus. Most of them, until that moment, still considered themselves Jewish. They attended synagogues, observed the Sabbath, followed dietary laws, saw in Jesus the promised Messiah within the Jewish tradition, not the founder of a new religion. But with the temple destroyed and the Jews scattered throughout the diaspora, with Jerusalem turned to rubble, the Christian community begins to redefine itself. It begins to distance itself from its Jewish roots. It begins to turn more and more to the Greco-Roman world, to the cities of the empire, to the converted Gentiles who had no ancestral connection to Abraham, Moses, and the prophets. And in this movement of distancing, something curious begins to happen with the memory of Mary. In the Greco-Roman world, Christians found a culture deeply accustomed to worshipping goddesses, not one or two, dozens, mother goddesses, virgin goddesses, warrior goddesses, fertility goddesses, moon goddesses, love goddesses. Each city had its patroness. Ephesus had Artemis, the great goddess whose legendary statue, with multiple breasts, was worshipped in a temple considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Corinth had Aphrodite. Athens had its protective Athena. Rome had Venus. In Greco-Roman Egypt, Isis was worshipped in mystery cults that promised spiritual rebirth to the initiated. Isis was often depicted with her divine son, Horus, in her lap. In a pose that, when you see it side by side with the earliest Christian images of Mary with the baby Jesus, it is impossible not to notice. The two iconographies are almost identical. The seated mother, the divine child in her lap, the serene gaze, the hand in a gesture of blessing or welcome. Coincidence? Spinoza would have smiled dryly upon hearing that word. Modern historians of religion, who study the development of sacred images without dogmatic commitment, are almost unanimous in recognizing that the iconography of Mary with the child was in large part directly inherited from earlier representations of Isis with Horus. It was not plagiarism, it was not conspiracy, it was something much deeper, it was cultural adaptation. The early Christians, preaching in cities where people had worshipped a mother goddess with a divine child for centuries, offered them a new figure that filled exactly the same psychological space, but within the Christian narrative. People already knew how to relate to this type of image. They already had altars at home for this type of figure. The transition was smooth, almost imperceptible, but here begins to form a deep tension within Christianity. The early church fathers, the theologians of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, begin to discuss among themselves, what exactly is Mary's role? Is she merely the human mother of Jesus, or is she something more? Is she a temporary instrument of the Incarnation, or does she deserve veneration in her own right? The answers vary, a lot. Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around the year 180, begins to develop an idea that will be highly influential. The idea of Mary as the new Eve. Just as Eve disobeying brought death into the world, Mary obeying brought life. The formula is elegant, theologically symmetrical, rhetorically powerful. But notice what it does to the two women. It transforms them into opposite poles of the same moral equation. Eve becomes the absolute symbol of female disobedience, guilty curiosity, dangerous sexuality. Mary becomes the absolute symbol of female obedience, unquestioning acceptance, untouched purity. Between these two poles, no real woman can comfortably inhabit. Because no real woman is only obedience, nor only disobedience. No real woman is only a virgin, nor only a sinner. Real women are, like all human beings, complex, contradictory, capable of love and anger, tenderness and indignation, silence and speech, obedience and rebellion as the context demands. But the Eve-Mary scheme, once established, begins to function as a ruler, an invisible ruler that all Christian women in the following 19 centuries would be forced to measure themselves against. And the ruler had an interesting characteristic. It was impossible to be reached from one side and incredibly easy to fall from the other. No one could be Mary. Anyone could, at any moment, be accused of being Eve. Tertullian, writing around the year 200 in North Africa, goes even further. He writes a treatise called De Cultu Feminarum on the adornment of women, and in it he says, addressing all Christian women, a phrase that should send chills down the spine of anyone reading it today with honest eyes. He says in essence that every woman should walk covered in shame, because every woman is an Eve, every woman carries the guilt of having introduced sin into the world, every woman is the door of the devil. And he adds that it was because of the woman that the very Son of God had to die. Reread this. One of the most cited fathers of the early church, one of the founders of Latin theology, wrote, addressed to all Christian women, that they were the gateway of the devil and the cause of Christ's death. It is not an obscure fragment found in a secret library. It is a published text, disseminated, studied in Christian seminaries for 16 centuries. And within the same intellectual movement that produced phrases like this, the figure of Mary was elevated as the absolute exception, the only woman who had escaped the original female curse, the only one whose body had not been contaminated by sexuality, by desire, by the corporeality, common to all other daughters of Eve. Can you start to see the machine in operation? It is not necessary to assume conscious malice. The Church Fathers did not gather in a dark room to conspire against women. They were men of their time, carrying the prejudices of their time, writing with the conceptual tools available in their time. But the objective result of what they constructed, regardless of each one's personal intentions, was a theological device that functioned with relentless precision for 2 millennia, to legitimize the subordination of women through the production of an impossible feminine ideal. Spinoza, many centuries later, would understand this with the clarity of one who had no sentimental obligation to protect this structure. In his notes on how humans produce idols, he writes, and I will summarize in my own words because his Latin is dense, that every time a culture needs to justify a social hierarchy, that culture produces sacred images that reinforce the hierarchy as if it were natural, as if it were divine, as if it were eternal. Do men dominate women? Produce an image of a woman that is all obedience and silence, and present that image as the divine model of femininity. Do the powerful dominate the poor? Produce a theology that exalts poverty as blessedness and submission as virtue. Does the institution need power? Build dogmas that attribute to the institution the monopoly on access to the sacred. Every sacred image for Spinoza can be read as an involuntary testimony about the power arrangements of the society that produced it. And the image of Mary, constructed from the 2nd century to the 21st century, through a continuous process of theological, artistic, and political sedimentation, is perhaps the most eloquent testimony ever produced about what certain men in certain positions of power wanted women to be. But we are still at the beginning of this construction. We are still in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, in the early steps of the process. The great leap, the leap that would definitively transform Mary into a figure of cosmic dimension, an almost goddess within Christianity, was still to come. And it would happen in a specific place on a specific date, at a specific council, that forever changed the Christian religion and consequently the image of femininity in the West. The place was called Ephesus. The year was 431. And what happened there was perhaps the most revealing chapter of this entire story. Before getting there, however, it is necessary to talk about another element that begins to appear during this period and that has enormous importance for what would come next. It is the emergence of the apocryphal Marian Gospels, texts that did not enter the official canon of the Church, but that had a gigantic influence on the popular formation of the image of Mary. The most important of them is the so-called Proto-Evangelium of James, written probably in the second half of the 2nd century. This text, which the Church never recognized as canonical, was nonetheless read, copied, and venerated by popular Christians for centuries. And it is in it that the details that would later become unquestionable dogmas first appear in Christian history. It is the Proto-Evangelium of James that invents the names of Mary's parents, Joachim and Anne, which the canonical Gospels do not mention. It is the one that narrates the miraculous birth of Mary herself, saying that Anne, her mother, was barren and conceived miraculously. It is the one that tells the story of Mary being taken to the Temple of Jerusalem at the age of 3 and living there as a kind of consecrated virgin, something that historically never existed in Second Temple Judaism, where women could not even enter the most sacred areas of the sanctuary. It is the one that details Mary's perpetual virginity, asserting that even after giving birth to Jesus, she remained physically intact, with anatomical descriptions that today seem strange and even embarrassing. Notice the process. An apocryphal text, written by an unknown author more than 100 years after the events it claims to narrate, invents details that are not in any of the canonical Gospels. These details begin to circulate in popular devotion. Over the centuries, popular devotion crystallizes into traditions. Traditions transform into official doctrines. Official doctrines become infallible dogmas. And what began as pious fiction in the 2nd century ends, 1600 years later, being proclaimed as revealed truth of mandatory faith for every Catholic. Spinoza's method, looking at the seams, identifying the layers, dating the interpolations, reconstructing the real historical process of the construction of dogmas, applies here with almost surgical precision. And what it reveals, when applied honestly, is that much of what presents itself as immemorial and divine tradition is, in fact, historical sedimentation of pious fictions that at some point were comfortable for the institution that absorbed them. This does not make these traditions false in the sense of being evil, but it makes them human, deeply, irreparably human. And acknowledging this is the first step to looking at the image of Mary not as a window to heaven, but as a mirror to history. A mirror that reflects, layer by layer, what each generation of human beings projected onto her. Ephesus, June 22nd, 431. The summer heat of Anatolia stifles the city. The sun falls vertically on the white stones of the streets, warming the marbles until they burn the bare feet of beggars. The city is one of the largest in the Eastern Roman Empire, a bustling port, a commercial center, a meeting point for caravans coming from the east and ships coming from the Mediterranean, and, above all, the seat of one of the most famous temples of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis, the great virgin goddess, the huntress, whose giant statue, with multiple protrusions that some interpret as breasts and others as eggs or sacrificed bullheads, had been worshipped there for over 1,000 years. The original temple had been destroyed centuries earlier, it is true, but the memory of Artemis remained. The people of Ephesus had a deep ancestral, visceral cultural bond with that divine feminine figure. They grew up hearing stories about her. Grandmothers told them to their grandchildren. Merchants sold small statuettes of her to pilgrims. When the Apostle Paul, 380 years before that June date, passed through Ephesus trying to preach Christianity, he was almost lynched, according to the account in the book of Acts, because the silversmiths who lived off selling miniatures of Artemis realized that the new religion threatened their livelihood. The crowd shouted for 2 hours straight in the streets of the city. "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians, great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Keep this in mind. Ephesus, city of the great goddess. 4 centuries after Paul's near lynching, something extraordinary was about to happen in that same city. An ecumenical council, an assembly of bishops from across the empire, had been convened by Emperor Theodosius II to resolve a theological dispute that threatened to split Christianity in two. The dispute involved 2 men who hated each other, 2 patriarchs, 2 schools of thought, and at the center of the fight, a Greek word that would forever change the history of the feminine image in the West. The word was Theotokos. In Portuguese it translates as Mother of God, or more literally, she who gives birth to God. And you may be wondering, what is the problem with this word? Well, to understand the problem, we need to know the 2 enemies. On one side was Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria, a man of violent temperament, a brilliant politician, a sophisticated theologian, capable of ecclesiastical maneuvers worthy of the best palace strategists. Alexandria in Egypt was one of the most powerful seats of Christianity. It had a millennia-old theological tradition. It had a huge library. It had, above all, a historical rivalry with Constantinople, the new capital of the empire, for the religious primacy of the East. Cyril had been accused years earlier of being complicit in the lynching of Hypatia, the pagan philosopher of Alexandria, brutally murdered by a mob of monks in 415. He was not, let's say, a man of excessive scruples. On the other side was Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. Also a theologian, also learned, but from a different tradition, the Antiochene tradition, which insisted on precisely distinguishing the 2 natures of Christ, the divine and the human. Nestorius had risen to the position of patriarch a few years earlier, personally appointed by the emperor, and had begun his ministry with a desire to reform the church, to combat popular heresies, to impose doctrinal rigor. He was a more intellectual man, less political, and this would be his fatal mistake, more naive than his Alexandrian adversary. The fight began with a sermon. One of the priests associated with Nestorius preached, in Constantinople, that Mary should not be called Theotokos, Mother of God, because that expression was theologically imprecise. Mary, he argued, had given birth to the human nature of Christ, not the divine nature. God could not have a mother in the proper sense. God is eternal, does not begin to exist. The correct title would be Christotokos, Mother of Christ, or Anthropotokos, Mother of Man. Nestorius supported his priest's position. The problem is that by this point, popular devotion to Mary as Theotokos was already entrenched. The simple people of Constantinople, Egypt, Syria, had been calling Mary Mother of God for decades. When Nestorius questioned the title, a wave of popular indignation arose, and Cyril, sensing the political opportunity to destroy his rival in Constantinople, mobilized all his resources. He wrote letters. He sent emissaries to Rome. He secured the support of Pope Celestine, and he pressured for the convocation of the council. Theodosius II convened the assembly in Ephesus. Notice the choice of location. Ephesus, the city of the great goddess. Cyril knew very well what he was doing by insisting on this location. The local population, culturally and emotionally predisposed to venerate divine feminine figures, would be a natural ally in defending the title Theotokos. On June 22, 431, Cyril opened the council. He actually opened it before the Eastern bishops allied with Nestorius had arrived. It was a blatant political maneuver. The bishops of Antioch and Syria were still traveling, delayed by problems on the road. Cyril did not wait. He opened the session with about 200 bishops favorable to his position, condemned Nestorius in absentia, declared the title Theotokos as a dogma of mandatory faith, and proclaimed the sentence of deposition of the Patriarch of Constantinople. Meanwhile, while this was happening inside the basilica where the council was meeting, something even more significant was happening outside. The people of Ephesus, knowing that the meeting was about Mary and the title Mother of God, flooded the streets en masse. They lit torches. They shouted. They cheered the bishops as they came out. They formed nighttime processions carrying images of Mary through the streets of the city. According to contemporary accounts, some cried with emotion, some danced, some kissed the feet of the Alexandrian bishops for defending the honor of the Mother of God. And here, if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of the same streets where, 4 centuries earlier, the crowd had shouted for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Only now the cry had changed. Now it was, "Great is Mary, Mother of God." The psychological and cultural structure of veneration was exactly the same. The city that needed a great goddess still needed a great goddess. The new religion to establish itself had absorbed and readapted the old. The Council of Ephesus was not simply defining a theological doctrine. It was officially ratifying a cultural process that had already been happening spontaneously for centuries. The transformation of Mary, from the human mother of the Nazarene prophet, into a cosmic figure that occupied, within Christianity, exactly the psychological space that pagan goddesses occupied in previous religions. Spinoza, reading this story 1200 years later in his historical research, would note with clinical precision. Here is a perfect example of how sacred doctrines are, in fact, political sedimentations of human disputes. What would present itself to the faithful in the following centuries as eternal truth revealed by God had been decided by an assembly marked by political maneuvers, popular pressure, institutional rivalries between Alexandria and Constantinople, and the strategic convenience of absorbing still-living pagan cults in the population. Nestorius, after the council, was deposed, exiled, humiliated. He died somewhere in the Egyptian desert years later, forgotten. His works were burned. His name became synonymous with heresy. Generations of theology students in the following centuries would learn the word Nestorianism as a designation of a terrible error, without ever really knowing what Nestorius had tried to say or for what political reasons he had lost. Cyril triumphed. He became a saint, a doctor of the Church. His name now appears in liturgical calendars around the world. And Mary? Mary was officially elevated to Theotokos, Mother of God, definitively and irrevocably. From that moment on, the process of transforming the historical woman of Nazareth into an almost divine figure was dogmatically consolidated. There was no turning back. Anyone who dared, in the following centuries, To question this title would be immediately accused of Nestorian heresy and treated accordingly. In the centuries that followed Ephesus, Marian veneration exploded. Churches began to be dedicated to her in increasing numbers. In Rome, Pope Sixtus III ordered the construction, shortly after the council, of the great Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, one of the largest churches dedicated to Mary in all of Christendom, still standing today. In the mosaics of this basilica, which you can see if you visit Rome, Mary appears for the first time represented with majestic, almost imperial dimensions, seated on a throne, surrounded by angels, dressed in colors that imitate the garments of Roman empresses. Empresses, keep that word. Because it is in the period immediately following Ephesus that the image of Mary begins to absorb, also, elements of Roman imperial iconography. She begins to be represented with a crown. She begins to be represented on a throne. She begins to be called Queen of Heaven, a title that, historically, no biblical text attributes to her, but which in the Old Testament appears as a designation of pagan goddesses condemned by the prophets. Jeremiah, in chapter 44, strikes down the Israelites who worshipped the Queen of Heaven, probably the Assyrian goddess Ishtar, promising divine punishment. A little over 1,000 years later, the same title, with the same visual ornaments, would be applied to Mary without anyone seeming to notice the historical irony. Spinoza's method, when applied to this process, produces a disturbing image. The image of a figure, the Mary who reached the Middle Ages as the crowned Queen of Heaven, who is in fact a mosaic composed of pieces from 3 different origins. One layer is the historical woman of Nazareth, of whom only very faint echoes remain. A second layer is that of the pagan mother goddess, absorbed from Greco-Roman religiosity. And a third layer is that of the Roman empress, adopted as a visual model after Christianity became the official religion of the empire in the late 4th century. 3 layers, 3 origins, 3 completely distinct cultural streams, and all of this presented to the common faithful as if it were a single univocal reality eternally true revealed by God since all eternity. The genius of the device lies precisely in the perfect invisibility of the seams. When you look at the image of Mary in any European church from the 17th century, you do not see 3 layers. You see a unique, coherent woman, seemingly natural. The scars of the historical process have been so well hidden that they require the trained eye of a Spinoza, or the curious and patient gaze of someone like you, who is willing to follow this investigation to the end, to be perceived. Now let's enter a Gothic cathedral. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine. You are in Chartres, France on any day in the 13th century. You walk through the western portal of the cathedral, passing through the portals carved with hundreds of stone figures that tell, in images, the entire history of salvation to an overwhelmingly illiterate population. The air inside is cooler. It smells of ancient incense, of melted wax from thousands of candles, of damp stone, of the old fabric of pilgrims' cloaks. Your eyes take time to adjust to the dim light, and then gradually you begin to see. Light is coming through the stained glass. Blue. A specific blue, a blue that is neither the blue of the sky nor the blue of the sea. A deep, almost liquid blue that seems to have been extracted directly from the depths of a precious stone. Art historians call it Chartres blue. It is produced with an extremely rare and expensive cobalt, imported from distant mines, diluted in molten glass at very high temperatures according to techniques kept secret by generations of artisans. This blue covers the windows of the cathedral, and mainly it covers the cloaks of the figures of Mary represented in glass, in the garments carved in stone, in the images painted on the altar. Why blue? This question seems silly. It seems like one of those questions that no one asks because everyone thinks it is obvious that Mary has always been dressed in blue. But Spinoza, with his obsession for questioning the obvious, would ask exactly that question. And the answer, when you investigate it deeply, is revealing. Mary did not always dress in blue. In the early centuries of Christianity, in the oldest surviving representations of Mary, frescoes in the catacombs of Rome, icons from Coptic Egypt, Byzantine mosaics from the 5th and 6th centuries, she often appears in purple, in dark purple, in brown, in earthy tones that resembled the colors of the common garments of women from the Eastern Mediterranean. Purple, when used, carried a specific meaning. It was the color of emperors. Dressing Mary in purple equated her with imperial dignity. The blue, as the dominant color of the Marian mantle, appears late. It begins to consolidate from the 12th century during the explosion of what historians call the medieval Marian cult. And the reason for the adoption of blue, according to the most rigorous historical research, is a combination of practical, symbolic, and economic factors that came together around this time. First, high-quality cobalt blue was, at that time, one of the most expensive and difficult colors to produce. Using blue in a painting was ostentatious. It was expensive. It was a sign that the commissioner of the work had the money to afford the most valuable pigment on the market. Reserving blue for Mary was, therefore, a way to signal her special importance, her superiority over all the other figures represented in the same scene. This has an economic implication that often goes unnoticed. The cult of Mary flourished, not by chance, in the same period when Europe began to accumulate enough wealth to finance large-scale artistic projects. The Gothic cathedrals cost fortunes. Someone was paying for them, and those who paid wanted to see a Mary portrayed that reflected the economic and political splendor of the time, an imperial rich-crowned Mary enveloped in expensive pigments. Second, blue carries symbolisms that fit perfectly into the ideological project being constructed. Blue is the color of the sky, thus the color of transcendence, elevation, distancing from the material world. Blue is the color of the deep sea, thus the color of the unfathomable, of mystery, of what cannot be fully understood. Blue is a cold color, thus opposed to red, which is the color of blood, of passion, of desire. Dressing Mary in blue was, visually, to codify her as someone who belonged to the transcendent plane, not to the carnal plane. Someone who was serene, not passionate. Someone whose body did not burn, did not desire, did not bleed like the body of common women. And here is the point that Spinoza would teach us to perceive. None of this is casual. None of this is merely aesthetic taste. Every element of the image conveys an ideological message, and these messages, repeated in millions of images over hundreds of years, shape the way entire societies think about the feminine, about the body, about purity, about desire. But the blue mantle is just the beginning. Let's look at other elements of the visual construction. Mary's eyes in medieval and modern representations are almost always downcast. Looking down, looking toward the boy, looking at her own folded hands, looking toward nothing, in a semicircle of inner recollection. Rarely does she look directly at the viewer. Rarely does she look up to the heavens, to God the Father. Rarely does she look forward with authority. Compare this with male representations of the same period. Christ Pantocrator, in the Byzantine domes, faces the viewer head-on with intense, almost terrifying eyes. St. Peter, in a Roman mosaic, looks up to the heavens. The prophets of the Old Testament, in the sculptures of the cathedrals, look with visionary fervor toward the horizon. The doctor saints, painted in their studies, look at the books they study, or at the viewer they expect to instruct. There is a direction in the male gaze. There is intentionality. There is the assumption that this gaze has the right to direct itself outward, forward, upward. Mary's gaze, by contrast, is systematically turned down or inward, systematically withdrawn, systematically contained. It is not natural, it is normative. In fact, there are manuals, medieval and Renaissance treatises on sacred iconography that prescribed in meticulous detail how sacred figures should be represented. The most famous of these manuals is the Hermeneia, compiled on Mount Athos and used for centuries by icon painters of the Byzantine tradition. But there were Western equivalents, Latin manuals, episcopal instructions, pastoral letters that detailed acceptable iconography. These documents prescribed, among other things, that Mary should be represented with her eyes in a modest position, with her mouth closed, with her hands in specific gestures of recollection or prayer, with her body covered by garments that completely concealed any suggestion of carnal form. And, importantly, they also prescribed what she could not do. She could not laugh. Laughing was inappropriate. Laughter was associated with lightness, superficiality, with the vain woman. Mary should always have a contained, serene, slightly melancholic expression, a discreet smile at most. She could not have her mouth open speaking. In hundreds of thousands of Marian images produced between the 6th and 19th centuries, how many depict Mary at the moment she proclaims the Magnificat, singing about bringing down the powerful from their thrones? You can search. The quantity is so small that it is statistically insignificant. The theologically most radical scene involving Mary, the scene in which she speaks, in which she prophesies, in which she sings aloud almost revolutionary words, is the scene systematically avoided by the iconographic tradition. She could not have her hair down. Loose, feminine hair, in medieval painting, was a visual code for sensuality, for transgression, for the dangerous feminine. Mary Magdalene, when represented, often appears with loose red hair, a sign of her former sinful life. Mary, mother of Jesus, never. Her hair is always covered by a veil, always gathered, always domesticated. She could not be pregnant. This is impressive. Despite all the Marian theology revolving around the miracle of conception and the birth of Jesus, visual representations of pregnant Mary are extremely rare in the canon of Western sacred art. The Madonna del Parto by Piero della Francesca, painted in the 15th century, is famous precisely for its eccentricity. It shows Mary visibly pregnant, with her belly protruding, one hand resting on her womb. It is one of the few representations of the genre, and over the subsequent centuries it was considered problematic, almost scandalous. Why? Because representing Mary as pregnant meant reminding that her body had been a body, had had a belly, had gone through the concretely physical process of gestation. And remembering this was to bring her too close to common women. The body of Mary, in Marian sacred art, is systematically disembodied. She has a face, hands, sometimes feet, but the body as a three-dimensional volume, as flesh with weight and mass, almost disappears under the heavy mantles. The garments flow in idealized folds that seem to exist more as sacred geometry than as fabric over a human body. It is a body that denies being a body, a woman who denies being a woman in the physically concrete sense of the term. Spinoza, faced with this systematic denial of Marian corporeality, would note an observation that is perhaps one of the most disturbing in all philosophical thought about religion. He would say, in essence, that any religion that needs to deny the body to venerate the sacred is, in fact, teaching people to hate their own existence. Because we are body, before anything else, before any soul, before any spirit, we are body. We bleed, we sweat, we defecate, we desire, we age, we die. And a religious tradition that through its central images conveys the message that the sacred ideal is a body that is not truly a body is teaching, without saying, that the fundamental human condition is impure, that flesh is the enemy of the soul, that desire is sin, that being a woman, in the full corporeal sense, is to be something that needs to be disguised, covered, tamed, transformed into a blue mantle draping over emptiness. And Spinoza, himself a deeply mystical, deeply spiritual man, would say, no. The body is not the enemy of the divine. The body is the form through which the divine manifests in the world. To despise the body is to despise the unique substance of the universe, which is also, for Spinoza, God. Any theology that is built on the denial of corporeality is a theology that moves away, not closer, from what is most real and sacred in existence. Return to the Cathedral of Chartres. Return to the deep blue of the stained glass windows. Return to the image of the woman with lowered eyes. And now you see her, perhaps for the first time, not just as she appears, but also as she was constructed, piece by piece, mantle by mantle, lowered gaze by lowered gaze, closed mouth by closed mouth, century by century of decisions that, when added together, produced not the representation of a woman, but the anti-representation of all women. The Mary of the Gothic Cathedral is the woman that other women could never be. And it is precisely in this impossibility, Spinoza would perceive, that the ideological efficacy of the device resides. The unattainable ideal works better than any explicit norm to keep subjects permanently in a state of guilt, inadequacy, and anguished search for a purity that will never be reached because it was designed to never be attainable. December 1854, Rome. St. Peter's Basilica is crowded. Bishops have come from all over the world, dressed in their embroidered chasubles, their tall mitres, their silver croziers. Pope Pius IX, Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti, is about to proclaim a dogma. A new dogma. A dogma that no pope before him had dared to proclaim in an official and infallible manner. A dogma that had been debated, discussed, rejected, accepted, redefined by Catholic theologians for over 800 years, and that finally, on that morning of December 8th, would receive its final and unquestionable form. The name of the dogma is the Immaculate Conception. Now, pay attention, because many people get confused here, and it is important to clear up the confusion. The Immaculate Conception is not, as many think, the doctrine of the virgin birth of Jesus. That is another thing, much older. The Immaculate Conception is a different, more radical, more specific doctrine. It is the assertion that Mary herself, at the moment of her conception in the womb of her mother Anne, was preserved by a unique privilege granted by God from the original sin that all other human beings carry since Adam and Eve. In other words, while the rest of all humanity, according to Catholic theology, is born contaminated by original sin, Mary, and only Mary, would have been born already pure, preserved, intact, without any ontological stain on her soul. Pius IX, on that December 8, 1854, proclaimed this doctrine as truth revealed by God, mandatory for all Catholics, under penalty of excommunication in case of denial. Now stop and breathe, because what you just read may need to be read again to be absorbed. A doctrine that was not in the Bible. A doctrine that was not taught by the early church fathers. A doctrine that was explicitly rejected by thinkers of the stature of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. A doctrine that was debated, with violent disputes, between Franciscans and Dominicans, between Augustinians and Scotists for centuries, a doctrine that until a few centuries before 1854 was a minority theological opinion within the Catholic Church itself. This doctrine was suddenly transformed into infallible dogma, into eternal truth, into mandatory divine revelation. How did this happen? Spinoza, reading this 21st century story, would have a smile of recognition, not because he would have approved of the dogma. He would have found the proclamation one of the clearest examples of the dynamic he dedicated his life to denouncing, but because the structure of the process confirms, with almost embarrassing precision, everything he wrote about how religious constructions operate. What he would have pointed out is the following. In the centuries leading up to 1854, the Catholic Church was going through a profound crisis. The French Revolution, half a century earlier, had shaken the foundations of the Ancien Régime, which was closely allied with Catholicism. The Papal States, territories that the Pope had governed as a temporal sovereign in central Italy for 1,000 years, were threatened by Italian unification. Political liberalism, scientific positivism, philosophical materialism, emerging socialism. All of this systematically challenged the authority and worldview of the Church. Pius IX, who had begun his papacy in 1846 as a moderate liberal, became increasingly conservative as the revolutions of 1848 shook Europe, and he himself had to flee Rome temporarily. In response to this crisis, Pius IX adopted a strategy that historians later called ultramontanism, to reinforce, to the maximum, the central authority of the Pope, to centralize decisions, to assert dogmas, to produce a more rigid, more defined Catholicism, more distinct from all other modern currents. And within this strategy, the proclamation of the Immaculate Conception had a specific role. It reinforced papal authority because it was proclaimed by the Pope alone, without an ecumenical council, inaugurating the model of papal dogmatic definition that would be formalized at the First Vatican Council 16 years later, with the dogma of papal infallibility. It reinforced the distinct Catholic identity from Protestantism, because Protestants have always rejected this type of Marian doctrine. and it reinforced ideological control over faithful women, providing a supreme model of immaculate purity to which none of them could ever compare. This last point needs to be developed because it is the heart of our investigation. What does it mean, culturally and psychologically, to proclaim as a dogma of faith the idea that there is a single woman in all of human history who was conceived without the slightest stain? It means, by direct implication, that all other women, all without exception, were conceived with some stain. It means codifying as unquestionable theological truth the idea that conception, the sexual act, the process by which human beings generate other human beings, carries within it something impure, something stained, something that can only be overcome by a unique and unrepeatable miracle. Now do a mental exercise. Imagine an 11, 12 or 13-year-old girl being educated in a Catholic school anywhere in the world between 1854 and the 1960s. She hears, repeatedly, that Mary was conceived without sin, that she is the model of Christian femininity, that women should imitate her as much as possible. This girl, who is starting to menstruate, to feel desires, to perceive her own corporeality, to become interested in boys, this girl absorbs from every catechism class, from every sermon, from every sacred image, the message that her own body, her own desire, her own carnal existence is exactly what the supreme ideal of femininity never had. She will never be Mary, not because she is bad, but because Mary was defined from the beginning as the only exception, the only escape, the only miracle. Being a woman, by dogmatic definition, is to be impure by origin. And the only pure woman who ever existed was so exceptional that her existence is itself a miracle that confirms, by negation, the rule of general female impurity. Reading this, if you are a woman who grew up in a Catholic environment, may provoke a lump in your throat. Perhaps you recognize in this scheme an invisible structure that shaped parts of your own self-image. The shame of the body that you carried without knowing where it came from. The guilt in the face of desire that seemed natural but was treated as suspect. The chronic feeling of inadequacy in the face of a standard that was never explicitly stated clearly, but permeated all familial, school, and social expectations. Reading this, if you are a man who grew up in a Catholic environment, may provoke something else. Perhaps a memory of the women in your life and your mother, your grandmother, your aunts, your sisters, and the specific weight they seem to carry, a weight that was not carried by the men of the same family, the same parish, the same social class. Spinoza, writing 2 centuries before the proclamation of the dogma, had already identified the deep mechanics of this type of ideological operation. In his theological political treatise, he describes how religious authorities, consciously or unconsciously, produce doctrines that have as their main function not to enlighten the faithful about the nature of God, but to keep them in a constant state of inadequacy, chronic guilt, and permanent dependence on institutional mediation for the remission of that guilt. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception fits in this Spinozan diagnosis as a perfect piece of the mechanism. It proclaims an unattainable ideal. It produces, by contrast, universal inadequacy. It generates the continuous need for sacraments, confessions, prayers, devotions, all mediated by the institution as a way to alleviate an inadequacy that the institution itself created. It is not an accusation of conscious malice. Pius IX was probably convinced in good faith that he was serving God by proclaiming the dogma. The theologians who advised him probably were too. The subjective conviction of the operators of a system, however, is never sufficient for Spinoza as proof of the objective truth of that system. A system can function perfectly to produce the effects it produces: female subordination, institutional dependence, shame of the body, without any of its individual operators having that explicit intention. The structure operates with its own rationality, beyond the conscious intentions of the subjects that maintain it. And here comes the most bitter aspect of this whole story. 4 years after the proclamation of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1858, a poor 14-year-old girl, daughter of a bankrupt miller, almost illiterate, asthmatic, named Bernadette Soubirous, began to have visions of a luminous woman in a grotto by the Gave de Pau River in the French Pyrenees, near the small town of Lourdes. The woman, according to Bernadette, had identified herself in Gascon dialect with a phrase that the girl did not fully understand. "I am the Immaculate Conception," 4 years after the dogma. A 14-year-old girl, with minimal education, who reports having received an apparition confirming, with literal words, the dogma proclaimed by the Pope in St. Peter's Basilica. You do not need to be Spinoza to identify the epistemological problem here. You only need to ask honestly, what is the statistical probability that a 14-year-old girl in a rural and Catholic region of France, in the years immediately following a widely publicized papal proclamation, would have a vision of a figure that literally confirms the proclamation? The Church investigated. The Church recognized the apparitions as authentic. Lourdes became, over the following decades, one of the largest pilgrimage centers in the world. Millions of people continue to visit the site every year, hoping for healing and contact with the sacred. The point, once again, is not to attack Bernadette's sincerity. She probably had in her adolescent brain a genuine visionary experience. The point is to perceive how the institutional system functions as a gigantic machine of circular confirmation. The Pope proclaims a dogma. The dogma spreads culturally through sermons, images, popular devotions. A girl in contact with this culture has a vision that reflects the culture she absorbed. The Church recognizes the vision as supernatural authentication of the dogma, and the dogma emerges from the process reinforced by an apparent confirmation from heaven itself, when in reality, the only thing the vision confirmed was the prior cultural circulation of the dogma itself. Spinoza would have recognized this structure of circular confirmation in any religious tradition in the world, and he would not be blaming either Pius IX or Bernadette or the millions of pilgrims. He would simply be coldly describing how these systems operate, how they feed themselves, how they immunize against criticism, how they produce in each generation new generations of believers who find within the system itself exactly the confirmations that the system needs to perpetuate itself. Let us return to the room in The Hague. Because Spinoza, after Reinsberg, moved again. He settled in Voorburg first, then in The Hague, in the house of a painter named Hendrik van der Spik. And it was in this house on a quiet street called Pavilionsgracht that can still be visited today that he spent the last years of his life. It was there that he wrote the final pages of the Ethics. It was there that he coughed more and more, that he saw his strength gradually fading due to tuberculosis, aggravated by chronic inhalation of glass dust. It was there that on February 21st, 1677, at the age of 44, he died quietly, with his landlord by his side, without prolonged agony, without drama. Spinoza died poor. His post-mortem inventory, still preserved, is almost moving in its modesty. A bed, a table, a few chairs, the lens polishing equipment. Books, many books, the bulk of the inheritance he left, and the manuscripts, the precious manuscripts that, within a few months, would be posthumously published by his friends under the discreet title of Opera Posthuma. The Ethics came out in December of that same year, and immediately, in practically every country in Europe, it was banned, burned in some places, placed on the Roman Index, denounced by Protestants, Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, and Jews with a rare unanimity. For more than a century, the adjective Spinozist was, in the European philosophical vocabulary, an insult, a synonym for atheist, materialist, nihilist, destroyer of all morality and religion. Only much later, from the late 18th century, with thinkers like Lessing, Goethe, Herder, Hegel, did Spinoza's greatness begin to be recognized. Einstein, in the 20th century, when an American rabbi asked him if he believed in God, responded with a phrase that became famous: "I believe in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the ordered harmony of the universe, and not in a God who cares about the destinies and actions of human beings." The thesis is as follows: the image of Mary that has come down to us, the image that hangs in your grandmother's room, that illustrates the covers of prayer books, that is carried in processions, that occupies the side niches of churches, that is reproduced in silver medals and cheap prints sold at shrine fairs. This image was not born ready. It was constructed through a specific and documented historical process over the course of about 18 centuries, and each stage of this process can be dated, located, attributed to concrete historical agents with concrete interests. The historical woman of Nazareth, as far as it is possible to reconstruct her from the oldest texts, was a rural Jewish woman, poor with dark skin, who spoke Aramaic, who had several children, who possibly sang a politically explosive prophetic hymn, who saw one of her sons die on a Roman cross, and who disappeared from history not long after. This woman is layer 0, the original layer, the layer upon which everything else was deposited. The first additional layer came from the late Gospels and the apocryphal texts of the 1st and 2nd centuries. It added narrative elements absent in the older sources, the virgin birth, the parents Joachim and Anne, the presentation in the temple, the idealized childhood. These additions responded to specific needs of the communities that produced them, in part, the need to compete with pagan narratives of divine births, in part, the need to fill biographical gaps that popular curiosity could not accept unanswered. The second layer came from the Church Fathers of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. They constructed the Eve-Mary scheme, placed the figure of Mary in paradigmatic opposition to that of Eve, founded the symbolic association between virginity and purity, between sexuality and contamination. This layer is deeply misogynistic in its objective implications, regardless of the subjective intentions of the authors. The third layer came from the Council of Ephesus in 431 and the subsequent absorption of elements from Roman imperial iconography and pagan mother goddesses. It transformed Mary into Theotokos, into Queen of Heaven, into a cosmic figure with attributes that historically belonged to Artemis, to Isis, to Cybele, to Astarte. The transition occurred with such fluidity that the result seems, for the later faithful, to have always been this way, when in fact it is a datable syncretic product. The fourth layer came from the Middle Ages, particularly from the 12th and 13th centuries, with the explosion of Marian devotion, the construction of Gothic cathedrals, the development of the iconography of the blue mantle, of lowered eyes, of the disembodied body. This layer codified in millions of reproduced images the medieval feminine ideal, silent, withdrawn, asexual, distanced from the material world. The fifth layer came from the Counter-Reformation, from the Baroque, from the Catholic response to Protestantism in the 16th and 17th centuries. It intensified Marian devotion as a distinctive marker of Catholicism, multiplied the apologies for perpetual virginity, explicitly rejected Protestant criticisms of Marian worship. Mary became a symbolic weapon of counter-reformist Rome. The sixth layer came from the 19th and 20th centuries, with the proclamation of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854, of the dogma of the Assumption in 1950, when Pius XIV proclaimed that Mary, at the end of her earthly life, was elevated in body and soul to heavenly glory, and with the proliferation of modern Marian apparitions in Lourdes, Fatima, Medjugorje. This layer added the dimension of ultra-modern control. While the world was secularizing, the Church intensified precisely the most supernatural aspects of Marian devotion as a way to maintain a distinct identity in the face of modernity. 6 layers, at least, deposited over the course of about 18 centuries. If you add it all up, the image of Mary that we have today is composed of approximately 90% of later historical construction, deposited over a minimal base of original information about the real woman. It is like looking at a mummy wrapped in hundreds of layers of bandages, except that in this case, the bandages are the dogmas, the sermons, the paintings, the songs, the devotions, the apparitions. And underneath all of that, the mummy itself, the historical woman, can barely be recognized. Now, Spinoza did not want to destroy this image. I need to make this point clear, because it is central. The Spinozan project was never iconoclastic in the Protestant or Puritan sense. Spinoza did not want people to break statues, burn paintings, empty churches. He understood, better than many moralists of his time, the anthropological function of images. He understood that human beings need sensitive forms to anchor their spiritual experiences. that abolishing images does not eliminate the need for them. It merely replaces them with others, often worse. The Spinozan project was different, more subtle, more demanding. It was the project of transforming the relationship we have with images, to move from a naive and idolatrous relationship in which we confuse the image with the thing represented, to a conscious and free relationship in which we recognize the image as a human construction, value its psychological and cultural function, but do not confuse it with the ultimate reality itself. Applied to the image of Mary, this means the following. We can all continue to be emotionally moved by the figure of this woman wrapped in a blue mantle. We can continue to recognize in her the strength of the maternal archetype, the comforting embrace, the feminine presence that consoles. We can continue, if we wish, to light candles before statues, visit shrines, participate in processions. The error, for Spinoza, is not in feeling. It is never in feeling. The error is in confusing our feelings with evidence about the ultimate nature of reality. Feeling the comforting presence of Mary before a statue does not prove that Mary, as a supernatural figure, is interacting with you. It only proves that your brain, conditioned by centuries of culture and by your own personal biography, responds emotionally to this specific set of visual stimuli. The feeling is real. The supernatural explanation for it is not the only possible one, nor is it the simplest, nor does it hold up when you apply rigorous criteria of evaluation. And more importantly, once you manage to see the image as a historical construction, as a sedimented product of many centuries and many interests, you free yourself from a very specific thing. You free yourself from the tyranny of purity. You free yourself from the impossible demand to measure up to a standard that was designed to be unattainable. You free yourself from the chronic guilt that this standard produces in those who take its demands seriously. For women, especially, this liberation has a particular weight, because the Marian device has historically been one of the most effective mechanisms of female subordination. Subordination not through brute force, but through the ideal, through the seemingly kind image of the perfect mother, who by her own unreachable perfection produced in all other mothers, daughters, wives, sisters, the chronic experience of inadequacy. Liberating oneself from this image is not to reject the sacred dimension of motherhood. It is not to despise the strength of care. It is not to deny the beauty of nurturing. It is, on the contrary, to recover all of this in its full human dimension, with its contradictions, its exhaustion, its legitimate anger, its desires, its menstruations, its real painful childbirths, its sleepless nights, its ambivalences. It is to recover the flesh and blood mother, fallible and magnificent, in opposition to the blue-mantled mother, unreachable and silent. Spinoza, at the very end of the Ethics, writes a phrase that has always moved me, translating freely. All excellent things are as difficult as they are rare. He is talking about inner freedom, wisdom, the life lived under the lens of reason. But the phrase also applies to this specific journey we are making together. Liberating oneself from inherited images is difficult. It is rare. Because inherited images present themselves to those who receive them from childhood as part of the very fabric of reality. Deconstructing them requires courage, time, patience, love for the truth, greater than the fear of the consequences of what the truth will reveal. But it is possible. It is possible. And it is precisely this possibility that Spinoza, working in the silence of his room in The Hague, polishing lenses that allowed human beings to see the invisible, offered to humanity as his greatest legacy. You do not need to destroy the image of Mary on the wall of your house. You do not need to argue with your grandmother about it. You do not need to reject the religious tradition in which you were raised, if it still makes sense to you. What Spinoza asks is something much more subtle and much more radical at the same time. It is that you look at this image, from now on, with the eyes of someone who knows that it was constructed, knows by whom, knows when, knows for what reasons, knows what it has produced in the world, both good and bad, over the centuries. And knowing all this, you now choose, freely, what relationship you want to have with it. This, and not anything else, is what it means to reach philosophical maturity in the face of inherited images. It is what it means, in Spinozan language, to move from servitude to freedom. It is what it means to consciously enter the silent community of those who think for themselves. There is a question that needs to be asked now, before we move forward. If the image of Mary was so systematically constructed as an instrument of control over women, as Spinoza helps us to perceive, then why have so many women, throughout the centuries, found in her genuine comfort, strength, and even inspiration to resist? How do we explain Teresa of Avila, who wrote about Mary with fervor and at the same time challenged the Inquisition with her books, founded convents against the will of bishops, and redesigned the spiritual life of women in 16th century Spain on her own terms? The answer, if we take Spinoza seriously, is fascinating. Once images are cast into the world, they escape the control of those who created them. The bishops of the Council of Ephesus wanted to consolidate a specific doctrine. Medieval theologians wanted to codify a subordinate feminine ideal. Artists of the Gothic cathedrals wanted to represent angelic serenity. But once the image was there in the stained glass on the altar, in the medal hanging around the neck of the illiterate peasant woman, it began to live a life of its own that no one could entirely control. Women who had no access to priesthood, formal education, or public voice found, paradoxically, in the figure of Mary a way to channel a feminine spirituality that otherwise would have had no institutional space. Praying to Mary was the only religious activity in which women could have centrality. Feeling the presence of Mary was an experience that no priest could fully mediate because it happened in the depths of consciousness. And many women, throughout the centuries, silently transformed this space into a territory of resistance and personal affirmation. Teresa of Avila is the brightest example. The daughter of a converso father descended from converted Jews, she grew up under the shadow of the Inquisition. When she began to write about her mystical experiences, she was denounced several times to the Holy Office. Her books were deemed suspicious. Her orthodoxy was questioned. And yet she managed to produce one of the most influential spiritual works in Catholic history, found 17 reformed convents, and die recognized as a saint. How? In part precisely because she skillfully wielded the Marian and Christological language that was considered above any suspicion. Who could condemn a woman who spoke of Mary with such intensity? Spinoza, always attentive to the complexity of human phenomena, would be fascinated by this dialectic. The same images constructed to subordinate can be used by sufficiently intelligent and courageous subjects as instruments of self-affirmation, not because the oppressive structure disappears, but because human subtlety always finds gaps within structures. Hildegard of Bingen, in the 12th century, did something similar. Abbess, composer, physician, visionary, writer, she invoked Mary and divine feminine wisdom, sapientia caritas, to authorize her own visions and her own intellectual role in a church that officially did not allow women in the pulpit. Catherine of Siena, in the 14th century, used letters addressed to popes and kings, written with the authority she claimed to receive from Marian and Christological visions, to influence European politics. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, in 17th century Mexico, wrote sublime Marian poetry while also defending, with theological arguments, women's right to education. The image that was constructed to silence paradoxically gave voice to some of the most powerful feminine voices that survived in the archives of Western history. This does not negate the Spinozan critique. It does not weaken the thesis that the Marian image was systematically shaped by patriarchal interests, but it adds an important layer of complexity. The human being is not a passive receptacle of the images it receives. The human being is an agent who, even within oppressive structures, finds unexpected ways to transform those structures into levers of affirmation. Spinoza, in the Ethics, advocates the idea that everything, to the extent of its power, strives to persevere in its being. This effort he calls conatus. The women who, over 2,000 years, transformed the Marian cult into a space of personal resistance were exercising, without theorizing in those words, exactly the Spinozan conatus. They took the material that culture gave them and secretly redesigned it within the very intimacy of their souls. Something in many of us still hesitates before the image of Mary. It is not just cultural inertia. It is not just fear of losing a childhood reference. It is also the recognition that this image, contradictorily, has been inhabited by entire generations of real women, who projected their pains, hopes, and silent resistances onto her. And this prolonged inhabitation left marks that now belong to the image itself. Spinoza helps us to dismantle the construction, but human history, in its vastness, reminds us that even the most ideologically loaded constructions can, over time, be partially re-inhabited by those who were originally excluded from them. This is a thought worth holding on to before we proceed. The Spinozan critique is necessary, but it does not demand an absolute rejection of everything. It demands rather lucidity. Lucidity to see the layers. Lucidity to distinguish what oppresses from what liberates. Lucidity to honor the uses that women and men have made of inherited images without failing to see the problematic origins of those images. Let us now look at a side of history that is often silenced. There is a figure, a black shadow projected by all the light of the Marian image, without which the Marian image would not even make sense as a cultural device. This figure is Eve, and along with her, a multitude of other biblical and extra-biblical feminine figures that served for centuries as a necessary contrast for Mary to shine. Think for a moment. For the immaculate to exist, the maculated had to exist. For the pure to exist, the impure had to exist. For the obedient to exist, the disobedient had to exist. The image of Mary alone in the universe would not function. It only works as a term in an equation that has another term, and that other term, in Western Christian culture, has been primarily attributed to the figure of Eve. The real Eve of the biblical text, if you read Genesis 2 and 3 carefully, is a figure much more complex than later tradition suggested. She talks to the serpent. She asks questions. She ponders. She ultimately decides to eat the fruit not out of stupidity or malice, but because, according to the text itself, she saw that the fruit was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. This last point is crucial. Eve seeks knowledge. Eve wants to understand. Eve is, in the original narrative, the first philosopher. But later tradition took this figure and transformed her into something completely different. Eve became the guilty one, the cause of sin, the one who dragged Adam down, the one who introduced death into the world, the one who deserves, for her original transgression, all the pains of childbirth and all the marital subordination applied later to the entire female gender. This misogynistic reinterpretation of Eve was constructed in parallel to the elevation of Mary, and the two operations reinforced each other. Tertullian, whom we have mentioned before, wrote that every woman is an Eve, all carry original guilt. Augustine, in the 5th century, systematized the doctrine of original sin, closely associating it with genetically transmitted sexuality, which made every human conception a participating act in the fall, except, of course, for the conception of Mary, who centuries later would be proclaimed immaculate precisely to escape this scheme. Spinoza, reading these constructions with the coldness of his method, would perceive the following. Eve and Mary, in consolidated Christian theology, form a rigid, binary pair. There is no space in this pair for the real woman. The real woman, with her complexity, her legitimate desires, her quest for knowledge as Eve wanted, her care as Mary offered, with her angers, her joys, her contradictions. This real woman doesn't fit into either pole. She is forced to measure herself against both extremes and inevitably fails in some direction. Worse, the two poles are unequally accessible. Being Mary is impossible by dogmatic definition after the Immaculate Conception, but being Eve is very easy. It is enough to desire, it is enough to ask, it is enough to want to understand, it is enough to minimally exercise one's autonomy. Immediately, the cultural structure identifies the transgression and activates its mechanisms of culpabilization. Other biblical women have suffered analogous processes. Mary Magdalene, mentioned in the Gospels as one of Jesus' closest disciples, present at the crucifixion. The first witness of the resurrection, according to all 4 canonical Gospels, was transformed from the 6th century onward into the figure of the repentant prostitute. There is no clear biblical basis for this identification. It was a late fusion between Mary Magdalene, the anonymous sinful woman of Luke 7, and Mary of Bethany. Pope Gregory the Great, in a sermon in 591, formalized this fusion. And for 1400 years, Mary Magdalene was painted as a prostitute, which completely erased her real role as a disciple and apostle. Why erase? Spinoza would point to the institutional structure. The medieval and modern church could not allow the existence in its foundational narrative of a female disciple with the status of apostle. This would destabilize the entire argument against female ordination. Therefore, it was necessary to transform Mary Magdalene into a repentant sinner. An admirer of Jesus, yes, but in a position of redeemed inferiority, never in a position of equal discipleship. Sarah, Abraham's wife, in the Old Testament, is another silenced figure. Lilith, according to certain late rabbinic traditions considered Adam's first wife before Eve, was demonized and expelled from the canon. Judith, who beheaded Holofernes to save her people, became a marginal figure in Christian lectionaries. Deborah, a judge and prophetess of Israel who led an army, rarely appears in sermons. The female presence in the scriptures has been systematically filtered to leave only figures compatible with the model of subordinate femininity. Mary, at the top of this process, does not function only as a positive ideal. She also functions as an instrument of erasure. Her centrality obscures all other feminine presences that could complicate the patriarchal scheme. When you enter a church and see an imposing statue of Mary on the side altar, ask yourself, where are the others? Where is Mary Magdalene with her role as the first witness of the resurrection? Where is Martha, who dialogued with Jesus on equal theological footing? Where is the Samaritan woman, who spoke with him about comparative theology? Where is Priscilla, teacher of Apollos, mentioned by Paul as his collaborator? Where is Junia, called by Paul notable among the apostles in chapter 16 of the letter to the Romans, whose name was systematically altered to the masculine form Junias by medieval copyists uncomfortable with the possibility of a female apostle? Almost none of them are represented. Almost none of them have their own altar. Almost none of them are venerated as Mary is venerated. The cultural device chose a single female figure to concentrate all devotion, and this figure was carefully shaped not to threaten the underlying patriarchal structure. Spinoza, at the end of this examination, would make an observation worth holding on to. He would say that all religious iconography can be read not only by what it shows, but also by what it hides. The absences are as significant as the presences, the silences are as eloquent as the shouts, and the apparent abundance of Marian images in Christian West is, viewed with critical eyes, also the apparent scarcity of all the other feminine images that could have been constructed and were not. The history of women in Christendom was not the history of Mary, it was the history of countless real women, with their contributions, their resistances, their intelligences, their sanctities lived in everyday life. But from this history only an emblematic figure, abstracted to the limit, dressed in blue with downcast eyes, silent, remains in official memory. And this reduction, in the Spinozan view, was one of the great cultural losses of Western humanity. Not because Mary did not deserve veneration, any real woman with her full humanity would deserve it, but because the excessive centralization on a single figure, idealized to abstraction, impoverished the repertoire of available feminine models for generations of girls growing up seeking references for what they could become. Let us now cross the ocean. Let's go to America, because the history of the Marian image, upon arriving in the New World from 1492, gained additional layers that no medieval European could have foreseen. And these layers, especially those that developed in Latin America, are revealing of everything Spinoza taught us to perceive. In 1531, 10 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, 10 years after Hernán Cortés destroyed the Aztec Empire and began the colonization of what would become Mexico, an indigenous man named Juan Diego, according to the official narrative of the church, had a Marian apparition in a place called Tepeyac. The woman presented herself in Nahuatl, speaking the indigenous language with slightly mestizo features, and asked for a chapel to be built in her honor. This was the birth of the devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, which would become, over the centuries, perhaps the most intense Marian devotion in the world. Now let's look at this episode with the eyes that Spinoza taught us to have. Tepeyac was not just any place. Before the arrival of the Spaniards, at that exact location, there was a sanctuary dedicated to Tonantzin, our venerated mother, one of the main feminine deities of the Aztec pantheon. The Aztecs would pilgrimage to Tepeyac to venerate this maternal figure. When the Spaniards arrived and demolished the temple, the indigenous people continued, secretly, to go to the same place. The devotion did not die. People needed that sacred feminine space, that maternal figure, that ancestral continuity. The apparition of Guadalupe, appearing precisely in the same location, with characteristics that combined Christian and indigenous elements, resolved the pastoral problem of evangelization at once. The indigenous people could continue to pilgrimage to the same place, venerating a divine feminine figure, and technically they would be within the official Catholic faith. The new devotion served as a bridge between the two religions, greatly facilitating the conversion of native populations. Spinoza would point out, without morally judging the individual actors, that this process is exactly analogous to what happened in Ephesus 13 centuries earlier. The new religion, by establishing itself in a culture that had a strong tradition of veneration for mother goddesses, produced a Marian figure with locally recognizable traits, occupying the same physical sacred space as the previous deities and gradually absorbing the pre-existing devotion. The method of Christianization was not primarily the radical destruction of native religions. It was the careful overlay in which the central elements of local spirituality were redirected, with minimal surface adaptations, to the new institutional structure. Guadalupe is the most famous example, but it is not the only one. Throughout the American continent, local Marian devotions emerged in correspondence with previous indigenous traditions. In Brazil, Our Lady of Aparecida, found in 1717 in the waters of the Paraíba do Sul River, gained characteristics of Afro-Indigenous Portuguese syncretism. In various regions of Hispanic America, local virgins emerged with names linked to geography or indigenous history: the Virgin of Copacabana in Bolivia, the Virgin of Chiquinquirá in Colombia, the Virgin of Quinche in Ecuador. Each of these devotions has its specific history, its cultural particularities, its importance for the populations that venerate them. But they all share, from a structural point of view, the same logic that Spinoza would identify. They are syncretic figures produced in the encounter between European Christianity and pre-existing local religions that serve to channel a popular religiosity that, without these figures, might have remained in more explicitly non-Christian forms. Here, it is important to make a distinction that Spinoza would certainly make. One thing is to critically describe the historical process of producing these devotions. Another thing, completely different, is to disregard the real meaning that these devotions had for millions of people who, for centuries, found in them strength, identity, cultural resistance, dignity. Especially for indigenous and Afro-descendant populations, enslaved and oppressed by Christian colonizers, the appropriation of these devotions was also a way to affirm identity, to preserve elements of ancestral traditions under an acceptable disguise, to resist, within the very imposed system, total cultural annihilation. Guadalupe, during the Mexican War of Independence in the early 19th century, became the banner of the rebel armies against Spain. Father Miguel Hidalgo, when starting the revolt in 1810, raised a standard with the image of the Virgin. The indigenous and mestizo people, fighting against the Spaniards, saw in Guadalupe the ancestral mother goddess, the protector of the native people, in contrast to the Spanish Virgin of the colonizers. The same image that had served to facilitate the conversion of the indigenous 280 years earlier now served as a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. This is the kind of paradox that would fascinate Spinoza. Images, once in the world, gain a life of their own. They are appropriated, resignified, transformed into weapons for causes opposed to those for which they were originally created. The history of Marian devotions in Latin America is full of these paradoxes. Our Lady of Aparecida in Brazil is another powerful example. Found by poor fishermen, her image is small, dark. Some theories suggest that it was originally a white virgin image that darkened over time in the waters. Others suggest it was originally a brown image. In any case, her blackness became an identity mark. She was particularly venerated by poor, enslaved, marginalized populations. She became the national patroness in 1930, and she continues to be, to this day, one of the most central religious figures for Brazilian popular identity, with a strong presence among black, mestizo, and peripheral populations. Spinoza, examining this phenomenon, would make an important observation. He would say that the error of the hasty critic is to assume that the historical deconstruction of an image necessarily devalues everything that this image meant for the real people who inhabited it. In fact, it is the opposite. The more one understands the complex history of a devotion, the more one can appreciate the human creativity of the populations that appropriated, transformed, and redirected it according to their own needs. The image of Mary in the Americas is not the same image that left Europe. It is an image transformed by the encounter with other cultures, other struggles, other bodies, other geographies. The Mary of Guadalupe is not the Mary of Chartres. Even though both are called Mary and both wear a mantle, they are different figures produced by different contexts with different meanings for the populations that venerate them. And this points to one of the most sophisticated ideas of Spinozan philosophy. Things for Spinoza do not have fixed and immutable essences. Things are processes, events, realities in continuous transformation. A religious image, viewed dynamically and historically, is not an eternal essence but a trajectory. Each era, each culture, each subject that relates to it contributes to what that image is in its total existence. Understanding this changes the way we look at everything, not just at religious images, but at any cultural reality, nations, institutions, languages, traditions. Everything is process, everything is continuous construction, and none of this is less real for being constructed. It is more real because it is the way human reality effectively exists. Now let's talk about something that is often avoided in discussions about Marian devotion. Let's talk about apparitions. Lourdes in 1858, Fatima in 1917, Boraing in 1932, Banu in 1933, Medjugorje from 1981 onwards. Over the last 2 centuries, dozens of Marian apparitions have been reported in various parts of the world. Some officially recognized by the Church, others not, all mobilizing millions of faithful, generating massive pilgrimages, transforming modest places into centers of global religious tourism. What would Spinoza say about this? First of all, he would not deny the subjective sincerity of the visionaries. Spinoza had great respect for the complexity of the human mind and recognized that intense visionary experiences are real phenomena, experienced by real people, with real consequences in their lives. Bernadette Soubirous saw something. The shepherd children of Fatima lived experiences that marked them. The visionaries of Medjugorje, whatever the final judgment made about them, are not simply lying cynically. But Spinoza would also ask questions that are often considered inappropriate within the devotional framework, but which are precisely the questions that rational method demands. And these questions are revealing why throughout Christian history do Marian apparitions dramatically intensify precisely in periods of greatest institutional crisis for the Church. Why does Lourdes happen 4 years after the proclamation of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, at a time when the Church desperately needed supernatural confirmations for this controversial dogma? Why does Fatima happen in 1917, at a time of European social revolutions, specifically the Russian Revolution, when the Church feared the advance of atheistic socialism? Why does Medjugorje begin in 1981 in the context of communist Yugoslavia, at a time when the Catholic Church sought ways to strengthen its presence in territories under Soviet control? These temporal correlations are not accidental. They suggest that apparitions function, from the perspective of institutional history, as spiritual responses to specific political and religious crises. I am not saying they are conscious fabrications. I am saying that the human mind, when collectively pressured by crises, produces visionary phenomena that tend to confirm exactly the structures that are under threat. Secondly, Spinoza would notice the strange homogeneity of the apparitions. In all cases, Mary appears with visual characteristics that correspond precisely to local and contemporary iconographic conventions. In Lourdes, she appears as a young white woman, dressed in white with a blue sash, exactly as French devotional prints of the 19th century represented her. In Fatima, she appears as a young Portuguese woman of the early 20th century might imagine her. In Guadalupe, with mestizo features compatible with colonial Mexico. Never, in any documented case, has a Christian Western visionary seen a Mary with the appearance of a first-century Palestinian Jew, dark skin, heavy scarf over black hair, face weathered by sun and work, which would be the historically plausible appearance. This culturally conditioned homogeneity of the apparitions is, for the Spinozan method, the most revealing evidence. It strongly suggests that what the visionaries see is a projection of the images they themselves already carry culturally, internalized since childhood through exposure to prints, statues, sermons, and devotions. The apparition does not bring new information. It confirms and dramatizes old information, and this confirmation, coming from seemingly supernatural sources, further reinforces the apparent truth of what was already believed before. Thirdly, Spinoza would observe the content of the messages received in the apparitions. Modern Marian messages tend to be surprisingly conventional from a doctrinal point of view. They recommend the rosary. They ask for more devotion. They alert against modern sins specifically identified by the Catholic hierarchy of the moment. In Fatima, the messages included concerns about Soviet Russia, exactly the concerns that the European Catholic hierarchy had in 1917. In Medjugorje, the messages included warnings against the loss of faith in contemporary society, exactly the concerns that John Paul II articulated in his pronouncements at the time. Mary never appears in any documented case saying things that would be doctrinally revolutionary or uncomfortable for the ecclesiastical hierarchy. She never asks for the ordination of women. She never questions the Marian dogmas about herself. She never corrects traditional theological interpretations. She never brings historical information that the Church did not previously have. Her messages are, without exception, perfectly compatible with the official positions of the magisterium at the moment she appears. This systematic coincidence between the content of the apparitions and the contemporary official concerns of the Church suggests, for the Spinozan method, an uncomfortable but inescapable conclusion. The apparitions function as mechanisms of institutional self-confirmation. They do not bring information from outside the system. They bring amplified echoes from within the system. And these echoes, received as coming from outside, give the system an appearance of supernatural backing that it would have more difficulty sustaining without these confirmations. Once again, this does not mean attributing bad faith to the visionaries. Bernadette Soubirous was, by all accounts, a simple and sincere girl. The shepherd children of Fatima were real children with real experiences. The visionaries of Medjugorje, whatever the complexity of the case, are not orchestrated frauds. What Spinoza would point out is not the individual character of these subjects, but the collective structure of the phenomenon, a structure in which prior faith produces visions. The visions confirm prior faith. The confirmed prior faith produces more visions, and the cycle perpetuates itself without ever touching on an external criterion that could, from the outside, validate or invalidate the whole. This is what modern philosophers of science would call epistemological circularity, and it is exactly what Spinoza, in the 17th century, identified as the distinctive mark of religious constructions that sustain themselves through internal confirmation rather than external evidence. There is still a particularly revealing aspect of modern Marian apparitions that needs to be mentioned. They have a strong identifiable political tendency. Apparitions approved by the Church tend to occur in contexts where they reinforce conservative positions of the institution, apparitions that could support progressive agendas, denouncing, for example, clerical abuses, demanding gender equality, criticizing alliances between the Church and authoritarian powers. These systematically do not happen or are not recognized. There are documented cases of people who reported visions with uncomfortable messages for the hierarchy, and these cases were, without exception, rejected as false. The discernment criterion applied by the Church to decide which apparitions are authentic includes, among others, the compatibility of the message with official doctrine. That is, by structural definition, no apparition that contradicts doctrine would be recognized as authentic. And this guarantees, in a closed loop, that only apparitions confirming the doctrine are validated. Spinoza would call this institutional circularity, a system that decides in advance which evidence is acceptable based on its compatibility with what the system already asserts is a system immune to refutation. And systems immune to refutation, from a rational point of view, cannot be considered systems that produce true knowledge about reality. They may produce comfort, identity, community, aesthetic beauty, emotional strength, but not verifiable knowledge. Here is a delicate point that needs to be said with care. Recognizing this circularity does not necessarily mean denying that there are dimensions of reality that escape rational method. Spinoza himself was a deeply mystical thinker who spoke of the intellectual love of God as the highest state of human existence. He was not a materialist in the modern reductionist sense. What he rejected was not the possibility of the sacred, but the institutional constructions that present themselves as exclusive and infallible mediators of that sacred. You may believe that there is some transcendent dimension of human reality and still apply a critical eye to modern Marian apparitions. You may recognize that deep spiritual experiences are real and still perceive that these experiences, when filtered through institutional structures with specific interests, often produce confirmations that conform to those interests. There is no contradiction in holding both perspectives simultaneously. What the Spinozan method asks of us at its core is just that, honesty. Not to confuse what we feel with what we prove, not to confuse internal confirmation with external evidence, not to confuse the psychological meaning of an experience with its ontological veracity. Keeping these distinctions clear is demanding. It is perhaps the most demanding thing philosophy asks of us. But it is also the only way to continue thinking freely in a world full of systems that gently or aggressively ask us not to think. We are nearing the end of this journey, and it is time to ask a question that may be the most important of all. A question that has no single easy or comfortable answer. The question is this: after everything we have seen, what to do? You have spent the last hours following a careful deconstruction, layer by layer, of the Marian image you inherited. You saw the life and courage of Spinoza. You saw the historical woman of Nazareth, almost erased under centuries of dogmatic sedimentation. You saw the Council of Ephesus, the Gothic cathedrals, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, the modern apparitions, the Latin American devotions. You saw how each element was constructed, by whom, when, with what interests, with what consequences. And now, at the end of this journey, you may be feeling a complex mix of emotions, perhaps a certain gratifying intellectual lucidity, perhaps some discomfort, perhaps some emptiness, perhaps anger on some level, for having received throughout your life a narrative that now appears much more historical and much less divine than it presented itself, perhaps sadness for generations of women in your family who carried unknowingly the weight of an impossible ideal. Spinoza himself went through this transition. He grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family, was educated in the scriptures from childhood, knew the rites and devotions as we know our own hands. And at some point in his youth, he began to see the seams. He began to see what had been there all along, but had been protected by religious education from any questioning. This process for him was painful. It cost him his family, his community, part of the social network in which he had grown up. It cost him, in a sense, an identity. But Spinoza discovered something on the other side of this crossing. He discovered that it was possible to continue loving God after deconstructing the institutional images of God. He discovered that it was possible to continue having a deep spiritual life without needing to believe in specific miracles, in private revelations, in dogmatic structures. He discovered that there is a way of relating to the sacred that does not go through institutional mediations, that does not require obedience to hierarchies, That does not produce guilt or shame. This way of relating, Spinoza called the intellectual love of God. The name in Latin, amor Dei intellectualis, seems technical and cold, but what it designates is, in fact, deeply moving. It is the experience of understanding that everything that exists, you, me, the distant stars, the wind that enters through the window, the thoughts that pass through your mind at this moment, everything is a manifestation of the same infinite substance, which Spinoza calls indiscriminately God or nature. And that understanding this, not at the abstract level only, but at the lived, felt, embodied level, is the highest state that a human being can achieve. Notice the difference. Traditional Marian devotion asks you to love a specific figure with specific characteristics, mediated by a specific institution. The Spinozan love of God asks you to love the totality of what exists, without institutional mediation, without the need for fixed images, without guilt in relation to an impossible standard. The two paths do not need to be absolute opposites, but they are different paths. And those who have made the crossing we are describing need, at some point, to decide which path to follow, or how to combine elements of both in a way that makes sense for their own life. There is no correct answer for everyone. Some people, after making this crossing, will choose to break entirely with the religious tradition in which they were formed. They will identify as agnostics, atheists, secularists. They will build their spiritual lives, because even those who claim to be non-religious have a spiritual life in some sense, around other references, other practices, other communities. Other people, after the same crossing, will choose to remain within the tradition, but in a transformed relationship with it. They will continue lighting candles for Mary, but with the awareness that the figure is a historical construction that channels, in a culturally available way, real dimensions of their spiritual experience. They will participate in processions, but without the guilt they had before. They will pray the rosary, but without confusing the comfort of contemplative repetition with proof that there is a specific supernatural figure responding to their requests. Still, other people will seek more radically reformed forms of the tradition. They will approach feminist Catholic theologies, which try to recover the centrality of other biblical female figures, and critically question traditional iconography. They will approach progressive Christian communities that openly embrace the historical complexity of doctrines. They will do the difficult and necessary work of transforming from within the institutions they inherited. And yet other people will seek completely different spiritual traditions: Buddhism, indigenous spirituality, reconstructed paganism, secular contemplative practices. Contemporary human beings have available today a repertoire of spiritual paths much broader than at any previous time, and this is a blessing of modernity that Spinoza in the 17th century perhaps could not even imagine how it would develop. The central question, from a Spinozan point of view, is not which path to choose. It is how to walk. It is the difference between walking under unconscious coercion of inherited structures or walking with open awareness of what one is doing, why, and what alternatives exist. Inner freedom for Spinoza does not consist of doing anything one wants in the impulse of the moment. It consists of understanding the causes of what one feels and thinks, and from that understanding consciously choosing how to proceed. Applied to this moment of our journey, this means the following. You now know things about the image of Mary that many people have never known or will never know. You know that she was constructed. You know when, by whom, for what reasons. You know what consequences this construction produced, in culture in general and in the lives of specific women. This knowledge is, in itself, a form of freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, the more subtle freedom to know what you are doing and to be able to choose to do it consciously. And this freedom, Spinoza would say, is all that philosophy can offer. It cannot give you final answers about the ultimate meaning of existence. It cannot guarantee that there is life after death. It cannot solve the deepest mysteries of human consciousness. But it can offer you this, the chance to live with lucidity, to choose with awareness, to love without guilt, to think without fear. And this, at its core, is a lot. It is perhaps the only thing that truly matters. There is a phrase by Spinoza at the end of the Ethics that I have always found particularly beautiful. He says, speaking of the wise person who has managed to reach the intellectual love of God, that this wise person is hardly disturbed in their spirit, but, aware of themselves and of God, and of things with a certain eternal necessity, never ceases to exist, but always possesses true satisfaction of the spirit. And he adds an observation that is practically a personal confession. If the path I have indicated up to this point seems extremely difficult, it can nevertheless be found, and it must be extremely difficult, certainly, since it is so rarely discovered. For how could it be, if salvation were at hand and could be found without great effort, that practically everyone despises it? But all excellent things are as difficult as they are rare. This last sentence in Latin, omnia praeclara tam difficilia quam rara sunt, is for many the summary of all Spinozan philosophy. Everything worthwhile is difficult, but that is no reason to give up. On the contrary, it is precisely the reason to try. And this is perhaps the most important message that Spinoza could leave you. That free thought is not the privilege of geniuses isolated in ivory towers. It is a real possibility for any human being who decides at some point to stop passively accepting what they inherited and begin to interrogate it with honesty. Let us end where we began. Remember the image we described at the beginning. That woman in a blue cloak, with downcast eyes, hands clasped silent, who is on hospital walls, on medals hanging around soldiers' necks, on candles lit in the early morning by mothers who weep in silence. Return to her now, mentally. Look at her, and notice how you have changed. She remains exactly the same. The cloak is still blue, the eyes are still downcast, the hands are still clasped. The physical figure has not transformed into anything, but the relationship you have with her, that indeed may have transformed profoundly. You now see layers, you now see history, you now see the men who painted, the councils that decided, the interests that shaped, the real women who were silenced so that this specific figure could occupy center stage. And this in itself is a transformation, perhaps the most important that can happen to any human being, to see with eyes that know instead of with eyes that merely believe. Let us imagine then what a relationship with the divine feminine, or with the sacred in general, would be like after everything we have traversed, not as prescription, but as suggestion, not as absolute truth, but as open possibility. First, it would be a relationship that recognizes plurality, not a single sacred feminine figure, idealized to the point of abstraction, overshadowing all others, but the recognition that the sacred, if it exists, manifests in countless figures, masculine, feminine, androgynous, non-human, abstract. The biblical women who have been erased would deserve to reclaim their place. The real grandmothers of our families would deserve veneration as real as any canonized saint. The untold feminine stories would deserve to finally be narrated. Secondly, it would be a relationship that honors corporeality, not the escape from the body towards a disembodied purity, but the recognition that the body, with its desires, its pains, its biological functions, its sensory joys, is the very place of human experience. Spinoza said that the mind and body are a single reality, seen from two different angles. Honoring the body does not deny the soul. It recognizes that soul and body are at their core faces of the same thing, and that any spirituality that needs to deny one to affirm the other is a truncated, incomplete spirituality. Thirdly, it would be a relationship that accepts complexity, not the reduction of all femininity to the binary Mary-Eve, virgin prostitute, pure-impure, but the recognition that every real woman, like every real human being, contains within herself a multitude of aspects that cannot be reduced to simplified moral poles. There is tenderness, and there is anger. There is care, and there is demand. There is silence, and there is voice. There is surrender, and there is autonomy. All of this in varying proportions at different moments in different circumstances. Real human life does not fit into simple archetypes, and any serious spirituality needs to make space for this complexity rather than erase it in favor of ideal figures. Fourthly, it would be a relationship that would abandon guilt as the main driving force. The traditional Marian image, especially after the proclamation of the Immaculate Conception, operates strongly through guilt. You are never pure enough. You are never obedient enough. You are never immaculate enough. This engine of guilt can be replaced, from the Spinozan perspective, by another engine, the desire for understanding, the desire for wholeness, the desire to live well. Spinoza believed that virtue does not consist in contracting in fear of sin, but in expanding towards one's own flourishing. People who grow through joy, not people who shrink through fear. Fifthly, it would be a relationship that would accept mystery without needing to dogmatize it. There is much more in the universe than any human being can comprehend. Spinoza was the first to recognize this, but this ultimate incognoscibility of the real is not a reason to fill the empty spaces with specific dogmatic assertions. It is, on the contrary, a reason for respectful silence, an epistemological humility, an openness to multiple possible approaches to what escapes complete understanding. You may have your intimate intuition about the sacred, but you do not need to turn that intuition into mandatory doctrine for others. Sixthly, it would be a relationship that would value real community over institutional hierarchy. Spinoza, although he lived isolated for much of his life, believed deeply in the importance of friends, of fellow thinkers, of the community of those who seek together. What he rejected was not human community. It was its hierarchized institutional form, in which a few decide doctrines and many obey. The community he valued was horizontal. It was the community of those who think freely together, who help each other, who do not need external authority to validate their experiences. Seventhly, it would be a relationship that would recognize the continuity between the human and the divine. For Spinoza, God and nature are two faces of the same reality. There is no absolute transcendence separating the sacred from the world. The sacred is here, now, in everything that exists. In the wind that enters through the window, in the eyes of the beloved person, in the sleeping child, in the old woman who prays, even if she prays to a figure whose institutional history has been problematic, in your own breath at this moment. The divine is not elsewhere. It is exactly where we are. And recognizing this transforms everyday experience into something deeply spiritual, without needing institutional mediations. These 7 principles, plurality, corporeality, complexity, abandonment of guilt, acceptance of mystery, horizontal community, continuity between human and divine, are not definitive prescriptions. They are suggestions that emerge from the Spinozan spirit applied to the issues we have traversed. You can embrace some and reject others. You can adapt them according to your own intuitions and experiences. What matters is the overall posture, to think freely, to choose consciously, to live with lucidity. And what about Mary? What about the specific figure that has been the center of all this investigation? She continues. She will continue for centuries, probably. Billions of people will continue lighting candles for her, praying the rosary, going to shrines, finding comfort in her image. And none of this is, in itself, a problem. Spinoza would not ask anyone to destroy these devotions. What he would ask is that each person who relates to this image do so, ideally, with awareness. Knowing the history, knowing the construction, knowing what this figure has meant for different women in different contexts, from the silencing suffered by generations to the creative appropriation made by many others. And for the real woman who probably existed, Miriam of Nazareth, a rural Jewish woman, mother of Jesus, possibly a widow, mother of other children as well, a flesh and blood woman who lived and died 2,000 years ago without ever imagining everything that would be built upon her name. For this woman, perhaps, the best tribute would be precisely this: to recover her real humanity beneath the dogmatic layers, to recognize her not as Mother of God in a cosmic sense, but as a human mother, with all that this entails of difficulty and beauty, to honor her, perhaps, alongside all the other real mothers, all the women who cared, all the silenced by official history. The historical Miriam can no longer respond. She has been dead for 2 millennia, but her memory, purified of later constructions, can serve as a different inspiration than it has until now. Not inspiration for silent obedience, but inspiration for the courage to exist as a real woman in a world that, in her time as in ours, has always tried to reduce women to prefabricated ideals. Spinoza died in February 1677 in The Hague at the age of 44. He was buried in a Protestant cemetery, although he was not formally Protestant. His funeral had few attendees. His complete works were published at the end of that same year and banned almost everywhere. For more than 100 years, his name was synonymous with atheism, nihilism, danger. He died without knowing if anyone would ever read his works with the seriousness they deserved. And today, 3.5 centuries later, millions of people around the world recognize in Spinoza one of the deepest thinkers in Western history. His ideas have inspired poets, scientists, philosophers, activists, mystics. Einstein quoted him. Borges read him. Goethe revered him. Contemporary feminists seeking to reconstruct theology in a liberating key find in him an unexpected precursor. Environmentalists trying to think about the continuity between humans and nature find in him a pioneer. Spinoza was right, in the end, about practically everything that mattered. He was right about the Bible being written by human hands. He was right about sacred images being historical constructions. He was right about religious institutions tending to confuse their own interests with divine will. He was right about the possibility of a deep spiritual life outside traditional institutional frameworks. He was right about the continuity between mind and body, between human and nature, between God and the world. And the man who was right about so many central things was excommunicated at 23, lived in poverty, polishing lenses to survive, and died of tuberculosis while still young. History has its ironies. Those who see further often pay more dearly for their vision. You who have come this far have also paid, at some level, the price of seeing. You may have felt discomfort. You may have felt loss. You may be right now at this very moment, not quite knowing where to anchor yourself after this crossing. It is normal. It is part of it. Anyone who undergoes a serious deconstruction always goes through a period of disorientation before finding new orientation. But I assure you, based on the trajectory of Spinoza himself and all those who have followed similar paths, on the other side of this crossing, there is indeed a way to inhabit the world that is freer, more lucid, more joyful, more connected to reality as it is. It is not an easy path. Spinoza did not lie about that, but it is a real path, traveled by real people, and available to you if you wish to follow it. The image of Mary may have been constructed to say more about purity than about truth, but the truth, more difficult and more beautiful than any invented purity, is available to those who have the courage to seek it. Now go, continue, think, choose, live with lucidity. And whenever you look at an image, remember the lens polisher who died in The Hague over 300 years ago, and who dedicated his entire life to teaching us to look with eyes that see. Here ends our journey through the 14 parts of this investigation. Spinoza has guided us from 17th century Amsterdam to the most intimate questions about how we relate to inherited images. We have not destroyed anything. We have only illuminated. And illuminating is, at its core, the only work that philosophy knows how to do, and the only work that humanity truly needs it to do. May this light accompany your days.